You've got your video off at the moment.
Mhm.
you want to let people in yet? And it's still only 13 minutes past.
If somebody's there, I think Clay's an organizer.
Hey, Stephanie, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good to see you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Yeah. Good, 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 good. Everything's going well, I hope?
It is. It's been a really good morning, or depending on your time zone, but yes, it's been, the morning went very well.
Good, good.
It went well. And we had a great, I mean, we'll see how many folks join us for the next session, but we had anywhere between 50 and 70 people online at any one time. So
Excellent, excellent. Are you admitting people or?
yes,
Yeah, I don't have to do anything.
you
No.
do not.
Good.
Hey, Matt.
Good morning. How you going?
Early
Good
morning for you, right?
Yeah, very early.
Yeah, I was looking at the time zones, and we had folks speaking at in Africa and India at 10 o'clock at night. I'm thinking, I bet Matt's coming on really early in the morning.
Yeah. How's it all been going?
It went really well this morning. We
Right.
we had a lot of we had a number of talks on the white-bellied heron.
Yeah.
And that was really good. And then Indra did the plenary on the white-bellied heron.
Yes, I saw that.
And then we had several on, Revo spoke on the Madagascar pond heron and Madagascar heron. So
Wonderful.
it was good.
Can I watch them afterwards, Clay?
Yes, they are. And I don't know, we'll get some more people on here in a second who will probably have that answer.
Okay.
But we are recording all of them.
Great.
So they will be, I don't know how quickly they're available, but they are going to be available.
Okay. Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, let's see.
How am I going to stop the dogs?
And Matt and Stephanie, and I'll Chip's going to be moderating this afternoon, but I'll be here as well. But all of you should have share screen access. So as we come to you, if there's any issues, let me know. But you all should be able to share your screen.
Okay. Great.
You want to put your presentation up?
Just wait a few minutes, yeah. Did you go out a different way?
Oh, she's coming out now. And then, thank you so much. You're all right, you want to talk? So much.
Clay, when do you want me to start screen sharing?
Yeah, I'll let you know. Chip should be joining us in a few moments.
Mhm.
If you want to go ahead and make sure that you can share your slides, you're welcome to go ahead and do that. And then we'll kick off in about 3 or 4 minutes as a few more people join. Because the Chip's going to be introducing each of you. And yep, I can see your slides well.
Good.
Chip's going to be introducing each of you, and I think he's going to say a few things about the session we're in right now.
Yeah. Okay. down.
Clay, at the end of, hey, Clay, can you hear me?
Yes.
At the end of my session, there's no need for questions. I'm just going to turn it right over to you.
Okay. Sounds good.
That's what you're doing is Q&A afterwards.
Right. Sounds good, Jim. Hopefully Chip is joining.
I won't have to stand up actually to do the forward and back. Oh, it's not showing it yet.
Everybody, we're going to get started in about 1 or 2 more minutes. Just waiting for a few more folks to join.
Clay, I've got 119. You're not going to wait till 1:30?
Was it 1:30 or 1:20?
120.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize.
No, you're
Okay.
good. Oh, Chip just emailed. He's not able to get in. So 1 moment. Well, I want to keep us on schedule because we have a full afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you are. I'm Clay Green, and I welcome to those that were not able to join us in the earlier session today. We had a really good morning with speakers. We had Indra Achara speak about the white-bellied heron, and then we had a number of other speakers. He did the plenary, and then a number of other speakers on the white-bellied heron, as well as the Madagascar pond heron and the Madagascar heron. We're going to continue in the African area, coming up next with Stephanie Tyler. I think Chip's joining, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce you, Stephanie, and then I will turn it over to Chip. But it's, excuse me, it's my pleasure to introduce Stephanie Tyler, and she's with the National Waterbird Count Organizer with Botswana and BirdLife Botswana, and she's going to speak today on update on the Slaty Egret in Southern Africa. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you. And good afternoon or good evening as it is from the UK. Yeah, I'm going to try and give you an update on what's been happening recently with Slaty egrets. And for those who don't know the beast, it is a globally threatened species because it's apparently declining. It's got a global population of probably between 2,000 and 4,000. So a pretty small population and restricted to Southern Africa, particularly Botswana. It's a lovely bird. Just trying to find where to
Can you see it?
move it on. Can you
Yeah.
Unlike the black egret, it's a small egret about the size of a black heron, but it's this beautiful blue-grey colour with a vinous throat, and the yellow feet in the black heron, well, with the slaty egret, they carry on right up to the tarsus, up to the knee. Next. Right, its global population, its breeding population is almost entirely confined to Botswana and to the very northern part of Botswana, namely the Okavango Delta, although it does extend across through the Chobe River to Kasane, right over in the northeast, and in the Caprivi Strip of Namibia. And just a close-up of the Okavango, and it's worth just dwelling on why this is such an important system for the slaty egret. The Okavango River arises in the Angolan highlands, and after rain there, water comes slowly down the river through Namibia and enters Botswana in January. And then the water spreads out across the floodplains, the swamps and floodplains, and carries on down the panhandle, that narrow part of the Okavango Basin, and then it hits two fault lines and it spreads out across a huge area of dry grassland, seasonal grassland, and pans and lagoons. And there are areas of dry land in between, but it works its way slowly south. And it's not until July that it reaches the south of the delta and enters the Tamalakani River at Maun. And in good years, then water will flow into Lake Ngami, down to the southwest, and through the Bateti River to the Makgadikgadi Pans, where it's very temporary. So throughout the year, there's always good feeding opportunities for the slaty egret. It loves the drying floodplains, the drying lagoons, where it can more easily catch its prey. And just an aerial shot of a little bit of the Okavango to give you a taste for the floodwater, and the lovely mosaic of woodland, acacia woodland, mapani woodland, and these floodplains. Okay. Like most egret, it obviously eats fish, but it's not amiss to eating frogs, tadpoles, and also large dragonfly larvae. I should have said too that we produced, we had a meeting in Maun with member states back in about 2008, 2009. And as a result of that, I compiled a single species action plan for the slaty egret. Now, many actions were proposed in that plan, but unfortunately, many of the actions, as I'm sure is common to most action plans, haven't yet been carried out. But we do have some new information, certainly on distribution, on numbers to some extent, and also on their breeding. Okay. Oh, just go back. The map that I've just whizzed past is a map that BirdLife International produced some time ago. And you can see Botswana, the Okavango Delta in that green color. And the other green areas there are parts of Namibia where the bird has twice bred after exceptional rains. And that's the only area now that we have breeding populations. The dark blue are where the bird regularly wanders into Zambia in particular, up into the northwest there, into the Barotse floodplain, the Liuwa Plains National Park, and also into the Kafue Flats. But I'll talk a little bit more about Zambia in a minute. The pale blue are pretty well where slaty egrets can turn up at any time. They wander widely into Zimbabwe, other parts of Zambia, throughout South Africa. In fact, the whole of South Africa should be pale blue. And then over to the west in Namibia, they turn up regularly at Etosha Pan. Okay. I looked at the occurrence of slaty egrets in South Africa, and since 2000, there have been 44 records, mainly of single birds turning up at little wetlands and sewage ponds and so on, but occasionally 2 birds, and there's 1 record of 3 birds. And I've tried to put here where the months are that they occur. And you can see that very, very few in May, June, and July, which is the peak breeding season for the Slaty Egrets in the Delta. So they're probably all wandering pre and post breeding from the Botswanan population. I should say too that of those 50 records, the vast majority are in Gauteng, which is the province around Pretoria and Johannesburg, which is where most bird watchers live. But they do turn up pretty well anywhere in the Kalahari Desert after rain, in the Free State, and it's just very few observers in these areas. I'd like to thank Frank Willems for this map. This is a map of Zambia, again showing the Barotse floodplain, that purple blodge over in the west, and the other purple, dark purple, is the Kafue Flats. And birds are very regular here. And Birdwatch Zambia, with Cheoni Firi and a colleague, did some work in 2017, 2018, trying to find out if birds might be breeding in the Lua Plains National Park. Sadly, they didn't find any evidence of breeding, but over the months that they were doing transects and point counts, they did come across 31 birds. And in the Kafue Flats, the other dark purple area, loose aggregations of up to 100 have been seen. Although they tend to feed solitary, you do get these aggregations in good feeding conditions. But again, no proof of breeding, although Pete Leonard did see a short-billed juvenile bird, but again, it's no distance to come up from Botswana. The other crosses are where birds have turned up, and there's one right up on the DRC border there in the Congo river system. And there's since been a sighting within the DRC, and there's one sighting in Mozambique in the Zambezi Delta. I'm surprised that more don't turn up there, but a lot of people have been looking and not found them. Okay. I popped that in. That obviously is a black heron, nothing to do with the Slaty egret, but just to show the difference. And the Slaty egret never does this umbrella posture. But I put it in because it reminds me that our first genuine record from Angola was when Michael Mills, a South African, was doing some work on skin collections at the Bango skin collection in the museum in Angola. And he found 4 specimens that had been labeled as black heron, but were in fact Slaty egrets. And that was our first proof that they did occur there. Since then, there's been a sighting. The 4 skins came from the Kanani River, but there's been a sighting since from some of the headwaters of the Okavango River. And then Michael Mills with some colleagues was doing some boat work, canoeing work in that area, and they found another 10 Slaty egrets. There were 30 others that could have been Slaty, but unfortunately they didn't distinguish them properly from black herons. And it can be difficult. I had the bright idea one year when I was in the Delta to try and get a better idea of populations by going to as many roosts as possible in a short time and counting the different egrets and herons as they were coming in with a great team of volunteers. It was a logistical nightmare, but the other problem is as it gets dusk, it is very, very difficult to separate Slaty egrets from black herons. But they do roost communally with other egrets and herons, and they also have single species roosts. Okay. Back to the Delta now, because as I said, this is the one area where we do have a number of breeding records. Up to 2000, there were only 3 instances of known breeding in the country, plus one towards Kasane along the Chobe River. One of the old records was of up to 500 birds nesting in reeds. Well, sadly, we don't have many huge areas of reeds, partly because of the fires, which seem to be getting worse and worse every year in the dry season. But since 2000, we've found 9 other breeding colonies. I say we, this is all volunteers, guides and locals who live there who've been tremendous in getting out and trying to find colonies. Okay. Yeah, this is one of the problems. I mean, it really is a logistical nightmare, not only to find the colonies, but then to get to them to see what's in them. And this is some work that Mark Muller was doing. He found these heronries, and you can see how difficult it is to access them. You can't get vehicular access. Sometimes you can get boat access, but often it's very shallow. And just knowing what is nesting in the heronries is difficult. You get huge mixed species in the heronries, and the slaty egrets tend to be low down, hidden in the vegetation. So without disturbing them, it is so difficult to get an accurate picture of what's nesting and how many and so on. There's just a mixed group in that top one, but the sort of sites that they nest in, and this is where the bottom slide is where there's a black, the night heron, yes, like a night heron roost, but again, the sort of site that a slaty egret would nest in. Yeah, just some of the logistical nightmares, getting across the water in a Land Rover to get to this was to get to some of the roost sites. And right, this is Mark Muller again in the front. He's very intrepid. And what we found, thanks to him and a guide called Grant Atkinson from Lataka Safaris, is that most of the colonies we're finding now are very small, often together with rufous-bellied herons, and they love these date palm thickets. And there are thousands of these dotted around the delta. And to get to them, I mean, obviously they're wading through the water and yeah, never mind the hippos and the crocodiles and the lions around the corner. And that's to try and get to see what is in there. And if we can just have a look. Yeah, there's some of the data we're getting on the breeding performance is just brilliant, particularly the photographic evidence. We'd love to be able to put rings on some of these chicks or tags so that we can work out, where they are going at the end of the breeding season. But it's so difficult without disturbing the birds. And that is, one of the problems with the heronries generally in the Delta. With tourism, people want to get close to heronries to take pictures, and it does cause mayhem at times. Okay, and just, yeah, it could be anything, but that is a slaty egret chick and an egg. And the next one, yeah, just some of the photos that Mark Muller has taken. I'm not going to be very much longer. I mean, I haven't mentioned all sorts of things, and I haven't mentioned the threats that is causing this lovely bird to decline or possibly decline. Again, we haven't got a good enough handle on the numbers, but there's all sorts of hydro schemes keep coming forward for the Okavango River just outside Botswana. And if you affected the flooding in the Okavango Delta, it would just be devastation. So hydro schemes, dams, increasing human populations in the catchment, and increasing agriculture. In the Barotse floodplain in Zambia, there's more and more rice being grown in the floodplains. So you're removing a lot of the natural habitat. There's also big problems with alien vegetation and also with alien species like the American crayfish and disturbance I've mentioned, and also fires. Fires are perhaps one of the biggest hazards during the dry season. So that's a very rapid roundup, but I hope that will suffice.
Very good, Stephanie, very good. Any questions from the audience? Well, is everybody still sleeping out there, or are we? Well,
I have a question. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi.
Does anyone think it's possible that there is breeding in Zambia? Because I mean, the Barotse and like the Luambimba floodplains, they're so vast, and like to locate them in reeds, given that they're there like during the breeding period sometimes.
I think you're right. There could well be colonies we don't know of. I mean, the fact that we found these 9 new ones in Botswana, they're tiny colonies, most of them, you know, a dozen birds, if that, a dozen pairs rather. And as you saw with that palm thicket, you could just go past that without realizing there were birds within it. So I think we've a lot still to find out in Zambia. And I know Pete Leonard is convinced that they might be breeding in the Kafue Flats and some of the other big wetlands. And also in Zimbabwe, adjacent to Botswana, in that area around Kazangula, between the Chobe and the Zambezi. I should have said too, there was once a breeding record in South Africa. It's a historic one now from 1996, so a little while ago. And they nested in the Nil floodplain. And I say they, Warwick Tarberton found 1 pair nesting, but that failed. So they can, if conditions are right, you know, breed pretty well anywhere. And the fact that they've bred twice in Namibia in recent times, particularly when there's been heavy rain and a lot of the bush has flooded. And in the ones in just near the Caprivi, they were nesting in flooded acacia, floodplain acacias. So there aren't enough people on the ground, basically. And Zambia and Zimbabwe and the Okavango itself are vast places, and still much to be found out.
We've got a question here from Giselle in Costa Rica wanting to know if you've tried drones at all, or what do you think the applicability of those would be?
Sorry, what do I think?
Of drones, drone surveys?
Yeah, drones. Well, I know that Mark has been experimenting with drones, but you've got the disturbance problem. You know, some birds react to drones, others don't. I know there's some work been going on in Britain looking at grey heron breeding colonies quite successfully. And they found that the numbers that you detect from drones are twice as many as you detect from the ground. So possibly drones might be useful, but I don't know that they probably locate birds flying in, but you wouldn't be able to see within the thickets and, right. You know, within the acacia woodland, it would be so difficult detecting nests. And I don't know whether I said, but they do nest a bit earlier than the other egrets and herons, although there is an instance of them breeding within a mixed colony of other egrets in the Moremi Game Reserve.
Okay, I think we're going to have to move on, but thank you very much, Stephanie, for a really interesting talk on a great little species. I love it.
Thank you.
Okay, Matthew or Matt, are you around?
Yes.
Okay, our next speaker is Matthew Herring, not named after the herring gull, I don't think, but it's a good comparison. And Max is going to talk to us about the Australasian bittern in Australia. Take it away, Matt.
Wonderful, thanks, Chip. It's just I've got the screen sharing disabled from the host. That's all.
Stand by. Sorry, Matt. Let me see what I can do. I was afraid of that. Let's see. Why can't I cannot seem to give it to you for some reason. The best laid plans here. Chip, do you have Matthew's talk or?
Hey, Clay.
Yes.
Stephanie Tyler is still the host. You need to become the host so you can give co-host abilities to Matt.
Thank you. Hey, Stephanie, if you're there, can you know how to make me a host? Yeah, you're right. Good point. Thank you.
Saying Emma. Talk to him.
We're getting there.
Yeah. So if you can click on my name under participants. Chip, you're the host. You got it.
Oh, we've clicked on Chip, so we'll go back and click on Clay's.
Yeah, because Chip's electronically challenged.
And then some.
Oh, I've turned it him now. He's got to turn it back to Clay.
Okay.
It still says Chip is the host.
I think Chip has to give it to you, Clay.
Can I click on something?
Yeah.
Go to participants and what?
Click on my name under more and say assign host. We'll get there, Matt.
No problem.
Well, I have you listed as co-host right here.
But I need to be host.
Okay, so what do I do?
Under my name, do you see the more button?
Yes,
Click on that, and does it give you an option to assign host or
make
give?
host. Yes, I got it.
Awesome. Thank you. All right.
Good directions.
Hey, it worked out. All right, Matt, let me get this going for you here. Matt, I'm just going to make you co-host. That way you should be able to share your screen. Did it give you the option? Yay.
Fantastic.
All right. Thank you all, everybody. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Clay.
Well, it's a very early morning here in Australia, and I want to thank Chip and Clay for organising this wonderful symposium. Today, my talk is all about water and the wonderful Australasian bittern. It's one of the world's 4 large brown Botaurus bitterns, and there's a lot of people and organisations involved in these different projects, but I want to give special credit to Professors Kirsten Zander and Stephen Garnett at Charles Darwin University, to Neil Bull at the Rice Growers Association, and Anna Wilson at Riverina Local Land Services. In the background there, you can see a beautiful Phragmites reed bed embedded in the iconic river red gum forest, eucalyptus. So I'll continue on. So for a good couple of decades, the IUCN has had the Australasian bittern listed. It's globally endangered, and our best estimates now are of around 2,000 birds in total. And next month, there's a publication coming out. It comes out every 10 years. It's called the Action Plan for Australian Birds. And our estimate in there nationally is 1,300. And over in New Zealand, they think there's about 700 with a continuing decline. You might be able to see on the map there's also New Caledonia lit up. I have a feeling that they were always just a vagrant there. The most recent population estimate is from 0 to 50, but there's no recent sightings. So you're basically talking about a bird that occurs in New Zealand and primarily in the southeast of Australia. And over the last decade or so, there's been a lot of public funding for the conservation of this bird. It's becoming a bit of a flagship species for wetlands, and we've learnt a lot about the bird and how to help it. You might notice that the Murray-Darling Basin overlaps a big part of its range, and not surprisingly, 3/4 of Australia's Australasian bitterns use the Murray-Darling Basin. It's about 950 out of 1,300. And the core area is in the southern part of the Murray-Darling Basin there. It's known as the Riverina. Now, the Murray-Darling Basin is a real key area for Australia's agricultural economy. It's a highly regulated system with weirs and levees and channels, but there are still some very significant natural wetlands remaining. Climate change is fierce in this area, especially in the south, increasing severity and frequency of droughts, and the water politics are very, very polarized and divisive. And in 2012, there was a major water reform enacted through legislation. It's called the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and it centres on recovering environmental water, mainly from irrigators. And it's really sort of ended up with this, like it's inadvertently promoted this idea of farming and the environment being mutually exclusive. So onto the Riverina's rice fields. You can see the paper right down the bottom there, but just to sum up, we did occupancy modelling across 95 randomly selected farms. There's 189 sites, and our naive occupancy estimates were about 21 to 27%. And after we adjusted them for detectability and other factors, was up to about 23 to 35%. And when we applied the abundance, the mean abundance, and extrapolated it across the areas of rice that were grown, we ended up with 368 to 409 individuals just in 2 parts of the Riverina rice growing area. So when we considered the other crops, the non-early permanent water crops that we didn't survey, and the Murray region that we didn't survey, we have this estimate of 500 to 1,000 individuals using the Riverina's rice crop. So this is staggering. It's about 60% of Australia's population and 40% of the global total. Now moving on to natural wetlands, you can see Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide there, and 6 key wetlands in between. Overall, there's less than 30 sites that we know that support regular breeding or more than 1 booming male. And Barmah-Milawa, that wetland complex, you can see it right in the middle there. It's a critical site with up to 73 booming males. Now, fortunately, almost all of these key sites are in national parks or nature reserves or perhaps game reserves, but they are subject to water availability and vulnerable to droughts. So in the past, this environmental water that I've been I've been mentioning, it has been managed primarily for fish or frogs, or when it comes to birds, for colonial nesting species like egrets and herons. And so it's great news that the Australasian bittern is now being incorporated into the way environmental water is managed, you know, such as the timing, the frequency of flooding and prioritising sites. And one of the things we can do there to get good outcomes for that beautiful little chick you can see is to encourage early nesting and make sure there's a sufficient flooding period, but not to love the sites to death with water, to maintain that drying phase that gives you those early successional stages, that classic Australian boom bust cycle that these birds are adapted to. And also with environmental water, we can look at the value of maintaining drought refuges and keeping the vegetation in the condition, the height, structure and so on that suits the species. Over in New Zealand, there's this incredible wetland called Whangamarino, and it's considered New Zealand's key site. Back in 1980, that's 40 years ago now, it had 140 booming males. But now there's only around a dozen, so an enormous decline. I had the pleasure of going out with Emma O'Donnell from the Department of Conservation, and she was talking a lot about the water level fluctuations in Whangamarino associated with the dairy industry. So although New Zealand isn't the driest inhabited continent on Earth like Australia, it still does have these water issues. So in Whangamarino, nests might be flooded or they might be abandoned, depending on the water level, and there's also these impacts on prey. Now, moving back to the rice, there's lots of changes in the Australian rice industry because of water availability and the lack of it. And the way the crops are growing, the ponding period is being contracted to save water. Now, the blue dots there, you can see there the dates of nesting commencement. The ones above the x-axis ended up having sufficient time to fledge before harvest, whereas the ones below did not. And you can chase up more detail in that paper at the bottom there. But just in sum, it took the bitterns 77 days to begin nesting after ponding started. And at that stage, the rice was already just over 1/2 metre, and 65% of those nests, they had sufficient time for the chicks to fledge before the rice season was over. So this is in the early permanent water crops, when the water goes on in October and is maintained through until about March. That is the traditional way of growing rice. You'll see in a minute that the model we developed predicted that none of the new water-saving rice fields could be successful, whereas the model showed that the crops with ponding by early November for at least 149 days could be successful. And there's that data there, the red ones up on your left, up around 150, 160 days of ponding, getting the water on in October, they were able to be successful. Whereas the ones over on the right, which is becoming the industry standard now to save water, they cannot be successful before harvest. So how do we enable bittern-friendly rice growing? It's a fair challenge because water is such a key issue in the Southern Murray-Darling Basin. There's competition with cotton and almonds. Water is being recovered for the environment. As I mentioned, there's a lot of pressure on irrigators to maximize their yields per megalitre used. So we can engage farmers and raise awareness, and there's a lot of goodwill and there's motivation there to help the bird. But because so much money is involved, we've been looking at financial incentives, and we have an incentive program up and going with the Riverina Local Land Services, and just coming into this season now, we've got nearly 2,000 hectares signed up, so that's a great start. But the government funding is limited, and we're certainly looking closely at the willingness to pay of consumers for bittern-friendly rice. And I have some really good data on this that I'm finishing writing up at the moment, and it looks very promising that we can have a consumer-funded incentive program. And lastly, there's all sorts of interesting things we can do with new water policy, like, for example, integrating environmental water with private irrigation water. There's some of the bittern-friendly rice growers there, adjacent to a crop. And here's one of them, Scott Williams, with his adjacent habitat. And you can see he's got his water on nice and early there at the start of the season in October. So it's not just about early permanent water and a sufficient ponding period. It's about adjacent habitats, controlling introduced predators, maintaining grassy banks, and other aspects. And just to wrap up, the satellite tracking that we did a few years ago really emphasises the value of both the rice fields, where the birds are breeding up around Griffith there and dispersing to coastal wetlands for the winter. There is a lot more to it than water, we realise that, and there's just some of the other potential threats or factors that we will be looking at in the future. They're sort of interrelated. And just to wrap up with the thermal drone methods that we've been using, you can see this is out in a thick rice crop, which you would never normally see. But hopefully people can see that chick going off to the top of your screen. That's how we're able to monitor breeding success in relation to the incentive programs. Thanks again to Clay and Chip for organising this wonderful symposium, and to all my collaborators.
Thank you very much, Matt. Questions? Let me see. While I'm looking in the chat, what are your introduced predators?
In Australia, it's primarily the fox and cat, whereas over in New Zealand, they've got a whole bunch of things like stoats and brush-tailed possums. But yes, in Australia here, mainly the fox and the cat. Chip.
Here's a question from Giselle. How does the huge fire affect the bittern? The last huge fire?
Not so much. It's mainly restricted to the forests and the mountainous areas, so it wasn't such a big deal. Funnily enough, we're trying to reinstate traditional indigenous fire regimes to maintain those early successional stages in reed beds and other habitats.
Okie doke. I think we're going to have to move on. Thank you so much, Matt. It's a great story.
No worries. Thank you, Chip.
Okay. Our other moderator is our next speaker. Clay, are you on? Clay will be talking about the 15-year program of the Red Group.
All right, y'all seeing my screen?
Yep.
Okay, good. I'm trying to, I have people popping into the room as well, so I want to make sure I'm not. So Chip, you may want to make sure there's, or actually, I guess Matt, you're currently co-host, but anyway, if someone pops in, I will let them in. All right, so thanks for the talks we heard so far, and I'm going to switch gears a little, and I spend a lot of time talking about Reddish Egret research. And today's a little bit of a shift for me. This is more about the formation of the Reddish Egret Working Group. And so I'm going to talk certainly in how we blend science with conservation, but this is much more about the mechanics of establishing and the continuity of a working group, focused on a species. So if you're not familiar with Reddish Egrets, just very quickly, a little bit of a orient you to the geography of the species, right? So it's a species of the Americas, primarily North and Central America, with some in South America. We're going to hear from a talk in a little bit, I think right after mine, actually, from Oscar about Reddish egrets in South America. But in general, right, the bird comes in two color morphs. In the western portion of its range, it's the dark morph. In the eastern portion of the range, we primarily get the white morph. And then in the Gulf of Mexico, like including Texas, we get both color morphs. But it's a species that is mostly resident, if you look at this map here, but there are some migratory populations. One of the questions that our group kind of has been tackling when it comes to research and conservation is the movement, both from a genetic point of view as gene flow, but also physical movement of birds to better understand how the populations are connected. So where were we? In 2005, when we first met, we actually met at the Waterbird Society meeting in Jekyll Island back in Georgia. And I show Rich Paul's map from 1991 to really say that Rich's work, the late Rich Paul, a lot of the work that he did with Reddish egrets, there really wasn't much done after the 1990s until the mid-2000s when it started getting some more attention. But Rich's map here on your left is kind of our knowledge where we were. And as I mentioned, we met in 2005 at Jekyll Island. I think I saw Dale join the call. Dale may not even remember the meeting, but it was him, David Newstead, Eduardo Palacios, myself, and Stephanie Melvin. I think we met like at a TGI Fridays or something, very austere beginnings, but basically got people together that were interested in reddish egrets. And Stephanie was really the champion of the working group and pushed for a status review, basically to update Rich Paul's status. And from that status review that I wrote for the Fish and Wildlife Service, it came very apparent for the need for surveys. And so really the next step was we spent the next few years surveying reddish egrets throughout most of their range, not all of their range, but throughout most of their range. And so you can kind of think of the Rich Paul map, and then this is the map kind of where we were as we kind of tried to put things together where birds were nesting. And so, I apologize, these waiting room things keep popping up. So as we're doing this, right, as we're going out doing surveys, this was a great opportunity for us to network because, as I mentioned, there was 5 individuals at this first so-called meeting, but it was really, but if you look at the range of the species, and again, this is the breeding distribution, it was clear that we needed to find researchers, conservationists, people on the ground, people with agencies that are working on reddish egrets. And from that, right, we started kind of getting somewhat of a critical mass of people from the different parts of the reddish egrets range. As you can see from this map, right, the map is still incomplete. We had a lot of places not represented, but we at least had that sort of critical mass to where we decided to have an official meeting and workshop. We held this meeting in Corpus Christi, Texas in 2012. I give a shout out to Troy Wilson and Jennifer Wheeler. They were definitely the movers and shakers behind making this happen, including the funding to make this happen for this workshop and the drafting of a plan. And so this was really our first attempt to come together and basically talk about reddish egret conservation. And one of the things we did, and kind of the methods I'm going to talk to you a little bit today, but I'm happy to go in after the meeting or via email or Zoom at some other point, is the sort of the process on how we did this. If you're familiar with the open standards for the practice of conservation, it's a framework for conservation planning, uses a common language, common terminology, standard methods for planning implementation, and sort of that reflection reassessment. And this was the guiding document, the guiding tools that we used. And we hired a facilitator, a professional facilitator from Foundations of Success to help us basically be that person to facilitate the workshop, to keep us on track, right? To keep us from going down rabbit holes, but also to make sure we were sticking with terminology and methodology that was consistent and has been used over and over again. So one of the decisions that came out of this while this was going on is that myself and some students out of Texas A&M Kingsville were doing some genetic work. And so that really, the genetic work, the first look at the gene flow of the species really helped drive the conservation planning. If you look here, and again, I'm not going to get into all the molecular part. This is with microsatellites. I'm happy to talk to you offline about that and share the publications. But the main thing is we took the map and we said, all right, we've got the extremes, the Western and the Eastern populations from Baja California to Bahamas. And then we've got this, significant population in Texas and in Tamaulipas. And that's where we did our molecular sampling. And as you might expect, right, from a species that's a coastal specialist, we see significant genetic differentiation. And that is that you've got Texas and Laguna Madre of Mexico, one population in Baja and the Bahamas are separate. what that did for us, right, really the findings for that was that led us to break up the range of the reddish egret into management units, recognizing that not only could there be restrictive movement of birds across these regions, that's one reason to create management units. The second aspect was the threats in the different units or in the different range of the species and now within these management units are likely different. And for example, the models for sea level rise and climate change are very different for western portions of the range, very different from the hardened rocky shores of Baja California compared to the Gulf of Mexico, compared to Cuba and the Bahamas. So recognizing threats are different. And so we're going to manage, when we build this conservation plan, we're likely going to manage the populations differently. And so when we started with that created what we call a conservation target. So in order to figure out what you're going to conserve, figure out what you're going to manage, right? You need to focus on what are the actual targets, and targets have to be measurable, right? Targets have to be something you can measure. So we kind of pick the obvious ones, right? And that is physical reddish egret population. So that is birds, and then acreage, hectares, whatever square kilometers, whatever value you want to use for habitat. That is breeding habitat and foraging habitat. And that really drove sort of our planning for the next steps. And so once we know our targets, right, we know our map, we've divided up into these management units, and we can then, from these management units, let me pull up my threat rating here. I know, don't worry about trying to read all this font. I know it's small, but we basically, and I'm, like I said, happy to share this with you in the plan. We basically took all the threats that we could possibly think of for reddish egrets, and then based on the targets, population, nesting habitat, and foraging habitat across the three management units, Western, Central, and Eastern, we brought all of our stakeholders and partners together and we rated these threats. And that gives us an idea of priority of threats, right? Things like climate change, very high priority, versus things like shrimp aquaculture, a threat, but maybe not as high a priority. And then from that threat rating, and again, I'm giving you like the 101 version of conservation planning, but then from that, we develop a conceptual model. And that conceptual model basically identifies the threats, how they impact your conservation targets, which again is birds and habitat. And then you work your way backwards from that threat to look at all the indirect and direct results that lead to that. And the key from there is that's where you're going to develop your objectives and your strategies to figure out where to go from here. And so from that, right, we came out with the plan. Like all good plans, we had the workshop in 2012, and then of course it took us 2 years as a team of volunteers to actually get it written. But the plan came out, Troy Wilson, Jennifer Wheeler, myself, and Eduardo Palacios, the plan. And from that sort of gave us our marching orders to go out and do the things we want to do. Now, at the end, I'm going to kind of share you lessons learned from that. One of the lessons learned, well, let me backtrack before I get to that lesson learned. One of the key thing was we still had a lot of holes in the movement of the species and a lot of unknowns about the species as far as movement across the range, movement within the range, and how this was going to impact us or influence the global population, right? And recognizing where do we need to focus on, hey, let's just conserve reddish egrets in the Western Management Unit, but how concerned do we need to be about the populations in individual regions like Sonora, Sinaloa, Nayarit, Baja California Sur, or is it more of a larger population? So these questions still lingered with us. And so here what we did was we basically continued our banding work that we started, and then also had continuous genetic sampling sites from across the range to try to get a better model of movement of reddish egrets throughout the range, And that led to this model here, which again, there's a lot of arrows and a lot of busyness on here. The main thing I want to share with you from this, and this is kind of where we are today, and I'm going to talk about the next phase of planning in a moment, but this is all, these arrows represent unidirectional and bidirectional movement of birds based on banding data, telemetry, and molecular studies. And what this shows is that in the northern population, we've got a lot of movement. We've got a lot of movement around the Western Gulf of Mexico, both down towards Campeche and the Yucatan and up towards Texas, Louisiana, Tamaulipas. And then we've got kind of unidirectional movement of birds dispersing and moving down towards Chiapas and Oaxaca, no documented birds moving towards Baja California, which sort of supports at least a closed population here. There are birds that leave, but we don't have any evidence of birds from other management units heading to that direction. These sort of upturn arrows in here in both the Bahamas, Florida, and Chiapas, Oaxaca represent birds that are natal to those areas, not moving outside of that area. And then the question marks are where we are going from here as far as the ecology, the movement ecology of the study is understanding. We don't have a very good knowledge of South American birds and their potential movement into the Caribbean and potentially up the Isthmus of Panama. And then we don't really have any idea of movement of birds from the Yucatan throughout the Caribbean, especially Cuba and the Yucatan, which we know flamingos move freely between these areas. We don't know if egrets do. So while we're doing that, obviously we're thinking about climate change. But the key thing was when it comes to the working group is while we're surveying in all these parts of the range and we're collecting samples and we've got banding going on, we're building our network of people, right? This is where we were in 2012, and this is where we are today, right? We have increased representation in the working group throughout most of the range. There's a few places where we still need better representation, but we're getting there. And this really came about in the last 3 or 4 years, and that led to a series of workshops that we have had. We have met in Merida, Mexico several times. I had the good fortune to go to Cuba and meet and work with Lourdes Mujica and her lab there and sort of building relationships there and research and status update of the species there. We've met in many places in between. And so from that, it really led to kind of where we are today. We've built this network of people. As I go through the slides and as I'm wrapping up here, I've been trying to highlight my, I've been involved with the working group since the beginning, but we've had a fish and wildlife lead, Stephanie Melvin for a time, then Troy Wilson, and now more recently, Kelly Stone. They really have been the movers and shakers behind this. One of the things we did within the working group was, now that we had this critical mass of people, we formed committees. We all love committees, but sometimes that's where the work's going to get done, right? And so we formed a steering committee and then a planning, a habitat, and a communications committee so we could divide and conquer the work. Because something I didn't share with you, because it's sort of embarrassing, is that the first plan that came out in 2014, it really didn't go anywhere. It was a good plan. We've gotten wonderful feedback from it, but we didn't champion it. And we put too much work on a few people's shoulders to get it done. And we realized that through committees and through conference calls and virtual calls, that's where the work's going to get done versus placing it on the shoulders of just 1 or 2 individuals. So we formed these committees. And since that time, we now have regular calls and we've had meetings in a variety of places throughout the range. The last couple things to talk about that came out of this was we developed a structure for not only the working group, but it has a biological underpinning, and that is the range-wide conservation plan, which you see up on top, okay? That's the global umbrella plan that's actually in press right now. That is the plan that guides conservation throughout the range, okay? But then from that, right, we have our step-down plans that we typically call them business plans, which put dollars to conservation action. So here's the range-wide goals. We step it down to how do we actually make this work with dollars, and that develops our business plans. So again, the global plan with the overarching strategies dealing with range-wide surveys, with habitat prioritization, things like predation and human disturbance, which we've heard from talks today, the legal protection, the importance of education outreach, and certainly how do we continue as a working group. And so the last things we have is from the range-wide plan, all right, the development of the Mexico business plan and the US business plan that again put dollars to the work that we're trying to do. And so I'm just going to end with, and I think we can talk about this later today because I know I'm going to be short of time, but when it comes to working groups, we hear about this a lot, but needing those dedicated leaders to champion the species in the working group, recommendation for some sort of structure, some sort of governance that kind of helps you guide when you meet, how often you meet, and all those kind of things. And then the biggest thing is that plan implementation requires that continuous effort. We learned that lesson the first time. Our hope is with the new plan that's been revised, it's a 10-year strategic plan that through periodic meetings, through committees, we can get this plan implemented to fruition. So with that, there are many, many partners that have been involved in the Reddish Egret Working Group over the years, and I will stop.
Thank you, Clay. A very nice, concise story on how to run a working group, advantages and disadvantages, pros and cons. Are there any questions out there? I don't see anybody in the chat.
Probably because I went too fast.
No, you didn't. You were nice and slowly paced. You hit it right on the button.
Chip,
Oh,
I have a
Alberto.
question for. Hi, Clay. How are you?
Good, Alberto. How are you?
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Based on this working group, how do you find the relationship with IUCN? Because we had just recently the Congress in Marseille, and we are also in South America working very closely with all IUCN members and also promoting the participation of experts in the different working groups. So how do you find that relation, trying to build a global perspective, especially in these species, and how those recommendations come back to the governments, which at the end are the ones that are responsible for the management of these species?
Yep. No, it's a good question. I think so. You know, our working group's a little bit different in that we sort of created, we created ourselves sort of outside of the IUCN, and then obviously with my involvement with Jim and Jim bringing me on board, we kind of brought into it. But we are actually, the members of the Reddish Egret Working Group are not necessarily all members of the Heron Specialist Group. But for me, IUCN has been very helpful, especially of late, working with the species survival coordinators. I've had a number of virtual meetings of late, and they've given me some really good guidance on this governance, on networking, on fundraising, both for the working group, but also I think what we're going to talk about later with the Heron Specialist Group. So I would say that I think relations are improving, and I'm finding a lot more beneficial conversations, I guess, between big IUCN, SSC, and us for any working group.
Thank you, Clay.
Thank you, Alberto.
okay, I think we better move on. Thank you so much, Clay. Now, our next speaker is Oscar Ardella. Is Oscar around?
Yeah, I'm here, Chip.
Oscar?
Yeah, Chip, I'm here.
Okay.
Hey, Oscar, I just made you co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, looks good. Thank you.
Okay. So.
Hey, Oscar, you're free to begin. I don't know if Chip, were you waiting on anything?
No. I'm just waiting for him to appear. Oscar, you there? What do you see on your?
We may have lost Oscar. Yeah, we lost him. Well, everybody, let's give it a moment, and we'll see if Oscar. I'm going to give Oscar a chance because let's see, Deborah's up next, right?
Yep. Deborah, are you there?
Well, we'll give it a few minutes.
Yeah.
Hey, Chip, I'll
Yes.
monitor the waiting room. Do you
Okay.
want to, while we're here, to got some white space? Do you want to talk about some of the announcements you were going to make earlier?
Oh, yes, I was just going to remind or tell all the authors that we want to do the same sort of publishing thing this time with this Heron Symposium that we did with Herons of the World at New Bern. And that was that there are really three sorts of options that are available to you to publish this material. Obviously, you can go through Waterbird's journal itself. That's one option. And last time we had a special section in an issue of Waterbirds that just dealt with Herons of the World. I haven't negotiated it yet with the new editor whom we're still looking for, but that seems to be a popular way to go. That's usually limited to about 5 or 6 presentations, papers. And then we have our own journal, Journal of Heron Biology and Conservation, which has the advantage that we can publish in color at no charge. And I think that's a very attractive thing for certainly some of the tropical herons, the herons that we don't know very well, to see the habitats that they're in and see the birds themselves in sort of brilliant color. And then the other option for those who are maybe too busy to actually sit down and put pen to paper for any sort of length, we had some 400-word expanded abstracts last year, and I think we ended up with about a dozen of those. So that's another way to get your material across and to showcase your program a bit to the heron world that will be reading Journal of Heron Biology. And I'll certainly send out a notice to all the presenters today going over this again and giving you details and where to report. We'd like to start hearing back from people on what sort of option they want to pursue within the next couple of months. So this is the first part of November. So maybe by the end of January, I can indicate a semi-deadline on at least getting back to me with some sort of indication of what you want to pursue, or even manuscripts at that point if you have them ready. Well, we're still without Oscar?
Yeah, I think so. And I just messaged Deborah to make sure she was coming on in a few. Well, yeah.
We could take a 14-minute break if that's I mean, I don't think I want to start early because that's never a good thing to do.
Yeah, so well, I got a few things. Yeah, people need to take a break by all means, but
you could take a break. You could take a break and go to the virtual auction and
that's right.
And the raffle for the quick.
Yeah. And I'm going. Yeah.
Do you want me to? I think I go after Deborah. So if you want me to do it, just to save time.
Well, if anybody's waiting to see you 40 minutes from now, they'll lose out.
Deborah is coming on right now. So Alberto, I appreciate it, but yeah, in case
That's okay.
people are joining.
I'm here.
Yep, thank you though. Deborah's on, so we'll stay on track. How about, let me make one quick announcement, then we'll take a break, and we'll stay on target with let's see, I believe it 2:40 2:40 Eastern with Deborah. Let me just put one plug I'm going to talk about this afternoon, but in case people drop off, right, as I mentioned earlier this morning, you can see my screen. The Pan-African Ornithological Congress is in November next year, just about a year and a few weeks from now. It's the week of, for US folks, it's the week of Thanksgiving, which is great because I'm out of class the whole week. Doug, Chip, and I have submitted a proposal and have been accepted to present a Heron Symposium at that meeting. It is obviously going to have an African focus, but I just want to put a plug out for any and all of you with doing work in Africa or connections with Africa to please consider this. We're going to have some more information out soon about it. But we also have secured funding for this. It's not a huge amount, but we have secured funding both from the Waterbird Society and from the IUCN Species Survival Commission, so that we can fund African researchers to come to this meeting in Victoria Falls. And so Doug, Chip, and I are going to get our heads together and get some information out on this. But we're definitely going to be looking to recruit and encourage, people, anybody doing research in Africa on herons, egrets, and bitterns, obviously all three. We encourage you to consider attending the Congress and participate in the symposium. And we have funding, I think at a minimum, we want to be able to cover your registration costs. And if we can cover more than that, like lodging or whatever, or airfare, we're going to do our best. So more to come on that, but just a plug for the Pan-African Ornithological Congress next year.
Very good. Thank you, Clay. And that's in Zimbabwe.
All right, so Deborah, are you on?
Deborah's going to be talking about the world's largest colony of agami herons. And for those of you who don't know it, I've only ever seen one. I saw it in Costa Rica. It's a very, very colorful, spectacular bird. So it should be a very good talk. And I think she has a few zigzag herons thrown in on her colony.
That's right. Yep. No, yeah, Deborah, no, you're good. You got 10 minutes. I'm just making sure you were connected. So everybody, if you need to take a break, that's great. And we will resume in 10 minutes at 10 minutes, 40 yeah, after the hour, depending on your time zone. I'm gonna reach out to Oscar because yeah, I really wanted to hear about his observation. All right, Chip, I'll be right back. Get some coffee.
Okay.
Hey, Clay. I have a question just as a follow-up to your talk. And we can talk about this more later, but while it's on my mind.
Yeah.
Obviously, like a lot of the people in the Reddish Egret working group are with an agency, like Fish and Wildlife or whatever, where part of their job might include doing this. But how many people, and this is kind of a loaded question, but like, how do you work? Like you said, you're volunteers doing a lot of this. How do you manage this effectively? And of course, like you said, it took a while when this is sort of like a peripheral thing to what people are actually doing.
Yeah, I mean, the problems we've had, and Kelly and Troy and Stephanie can all admit, is that when you work for especially the US government, right, you can be told that tomorrow this is a new priority, yesterday's priority is no more, right? And they've dealt with those kind of shifting winds and had to Kelly is currently not active in the working group, not because she doesn't want to be, because she was told you're going to focus on the Mid-American Shorebird Plan, right? And so those kind of things happen. I think part of it is having people in different agencies, NGOs, where the species is a priority bird for them, and therefore they can allocate some of their time to come to these meetings or to work on planning, if that makes sense. I mean, we found the agencies where, like, Audubon said, hey, Reddish Egret's a priority in the Gulf. Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission said Reddish Egret's a priority. TPWD, yeah, somewhat, right? But basically finding the groups. Pro Natura is a fantastic champion of Reddish Egrets. Mexico's done more work on Reddish Egrets than anybody. And it's a species of importance to them. So finding the agencies, the groups, the people that's high on their list, and trying to pull them together is really how we've tried to do it.
Do you think some of the knowledge gaps geographically have been related to difficulty in finding groups like that?
Absolutely. Cuba, Lourdes and her team are fantastic folks working with terribly limited resources, right? They can't even use Zoom. They're not allowed to use Zoom. And so connections with them have been hard. A lot of it's been when we've been able to get Alieni to meetings, like in Mexico, or we actually were able to get her to the North Carolina meeting in New Bern. But in between that, it's just hard for communications. And then, I've started some conversations with the Turks and Caicos, where there are Reddish Egrets and a few other spots. But if it's not high on their list, you kind of have to be the squeaky wheel. And it's not that they don't care; they just got 50 other priorities, and you've got to try to make Reddish Egret a priority. So I'm pretty good at being the squeaky wheel.
I think me too.
Like you are with saddlebills, right?
Exactly what I was asking.
Exactly. I think it is. It's finding that critical mass of people that this is a species that they're concerned about. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. I saw that. I saw your chat there, Susan. That's right. I can't remember, Susan, what meeting it was at. I think it was you. Was it you or Patty? I can't remember who sent me that incredible wood carving of a Reddish Egret. It was definitely out of my price range.
I don't think it was me.
And maybe it was Patty.
Yeah.
Somebody, I can't remember, it was a meeting I missed. and there was some wood carving, woodwork done by an artisan, and the Reddish Egret. It was just, gosh, it was gorgeous. All right, Chip, are you there?
Okay, I'm there. I'm here, yep.
Okay.
So now we have Deborah. Deborah, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes. Okay, Deborah Chen is going to talk to us about the world's or what we think is the world's largest Agami heron colony and a few of its nesting associates. Take it away, Deborah.
I will need share screen. Okay, there we go. Screen.
Yep. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Oh, just a moment. Can everyone see that? And I will move this.
Yep, looks good, Deborah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Deborah Chen. I'm the Director of Communication and Collaboration at the Tapiche Reserve in Peru. And I am going to be sharing observations of a very large Agami heron breeding colony that we've been observing for the past 8 years at the reserve. Oops. This is a chart that lists the 9 known Agami breeding colonies that have reported active breeding within the past 10 years or so. I've listed here the most recent nest counts, and if available, the 2 most recent nest counts. These are from records of the Agami Heron Working Group, which is a working group under the Heron Specialist Group. So you have an idea of what the populations have been so far in different parts of Central and South America. And this gives you an idea of our location. So Iquitos is the nearest big city, and we're about 400 kilometers from there. The Tapiche Reserve is run entirely by ecotourism income. So all of our operations and staff are fully dedicated to tourism operations, and our conservation work is integrated into visitor activities. That means we don't have separate research funding or a research unit. And it also means that our observations of the heronry and the scheduling and timing were dependent upon our booking schedule, because we just bring visitors with us to the area. Our colony is located in seasonally flooded forest at the end of a lagoon. The nesting area is dry and walkable during low water season, and during the high water season, given that the flood level is abundant enough, it is possible to take a boat in through the forest access point, which is here. The Agami nesting season in our area can begin as early as January and can last through July. We first started observing the colony in 2013, and the colony has grown significantly year after year. The Agami are the first to arrive to the breeding ground, and we do have boat-billed herons that start arriving maybe about 4 to 6 weeks after that, generally after the first Agami eggs have hatched. Now, in 2016, there was a drought, and there was also a major overgrowth of floating vegetation, which made the area very hard to access. So we weren't able to take detailed observations, but we were able to confirm from this observation point here that the Agami did return and they did breed. In 2017, we still had very limited personnel and resources, but we were able to take an inventory of 5 areas spread across the 2017 breeding ground. Each area was about 100 meters squared, and we counted 515 nests total in that 500 meters squared. The 2017 breeding ground is about 1.2 hectares. So using the formula in the Agami Heron Working Group monitoring protocol for extrapolation, that means the estimated number of nests across that area was about 15,000. And then in 2018, we don't have an area represented for that because there was another drought, even worse than in 2016. The ground beneath the nesting area was dry and the agami did not return at all, nor did the boat-billed herons, excuse me, and we do not know where they go when they're not there. In 2020, the flood was very low and late. No agami were seen in the breeding area, and we suspect also animal populations may have been affected by a surge in poaching during the pandemic. And in 2021, you can see in this dotted outline here, we observed only a small group. It was maybe a few hundred adult agami, but not breeding. There were no nests, so they returned, but they didn't nest. The flood was late and the water level was maybe moderate to high. Unfortunately, there were reports of locals discovering 2 other breeding colonies, one newly established breeding colonies. One was about 16 kilometers southwest of our location, going in a straight line, and the other was about 10 kilometers east. So the agami did nest in those areas, and unfortunately eggs were collected there because those are outside of protected areas. This is a view approaching the colony from the lagoon side, and you can see this is a visitor activity. We have our visitors with us in the boat. And this is the approach from the forest side. And I have a little video here. It's a short 10-second clip entering from the forest side. There is audio, so just be ready to adjust that to suit your environment. You probably noticed that the loudest voice in there was the boat-billed herons. They are very loud. And at the peak of the breeding season, if approaching from the lagoon side, we can actually hear the colony a few hundred meters away. This is what the floating vegetation can look like. It's especially bad during drought or low flood years. And in the earliest phase of the reserve's development, we suspect that locals put fishing toxins into the lagoon, which affected the lagoon's ecology for several years afterwards, and also affected our ability to monitor the agami colony. But despite these challenges, we were able to observe various phases within the agami's breeding cycle over the years, including courtship. So in this photo, you can see the brightly colored faces. There's one with red, and there's also yellow, as well as the long courtship plumes, the crest plumes, the long light blue plumes on the head. And this is a 30-second clip, which shows the courtship behavior. I'd like to invite you to notice the difference in noise level compared to the first clip. At this point, it's just the agami that are present. And also take note of the facial coloration and the light blue crest and dorsal plumes. We can have a closer look at the face color and courtship plumes here. It was possible to see facial coloring transition in a matter of minutes, as Cushland and Hines noted in their 2016 paper. Now, the boat-billed herons appear to reuse the agami nests, and there are other reports of other species utilizing agami-built structures. The boat-billed herons, when they arrive, essentially double the number of adult birds in the breeding ground, but we don't notice a significant increase in nests. And we've also seen adult agami feeding their young, which are perched on the branches just next to nests that are occupied by boat-billed herons. It's possible that the boat-billed herons fortify the original Agami nest structure with leaves, though we've never seen the boat-billed heron carrying nesting materials or constructing nests. And it may be that that's a nocturnal activity for boat-billed herons. We've only observed the colony during the day. Now, the high density of birds in this area means that there are a lot of disputes. And a lot of the disputes are between Agami and the boat-billed heron. The boat-billed, as far as we've seen, the boat-billed is almost always victorious. They tend to be more aggressive than the Agami. The Agami are generally more timid, even in response to natural disturbances from the jungle. And this is about a minute and a half of various disputes between the boat-billed heron and the Agami. Now, the earliest Agami to arrive to the breeding ground make their nest at the center of the breeding area, and the later arrivals add on to the edges and to the ends, which makes the breeding ground both longer and wider. That means the earliest arrivals are the most protected at the center of the heronry, and nests at the edges are more susceptible to predators. This also means that it's possible to see juvenile Agami and boat-billed herons in the middle of the breeding ground at the same time that there are nests that contain eggs and hatchlings at the distal ends. So you can see these 4 photos were all taken on the same day in March in 2019, and we have an adult Agami on the nest still with courtship feathers and coloring, and hatchlings at the end, and also a juvenile boat-billed heron in the middle. And then we can still see hatchlings and chicks at the ends and edges of the heronry as late in the season as May. So remember, the first Agami arrived in January. And by July, we have, this is sort of the last batch of juvenile Agami and boat-billed herons preparing to, almost ready to leave the nesting ground. About the photo in the bottom right of the Agami spreading its left wing there is a photo published in another paper of an adult Agami taking this position while standing over a nest. And the caption reads that the adult is shielding the eggs and nest from the sun. I'm not convinced of that. I've seen other individual Agami taking this position, and to me, it appears to be more of a display in response to disturbance or stress. And this one you can see is a juvenile, and it does not have a nest or eggs to shield. At the outer edges of the Agami breeding area, we also have several other species that breed. It's just sort of along the periphery of the breeding area. So there are Aningas, great egrets, neotropical cormorants, We have kukoi that are above, and black-crowned night herons, Watsons, snowy egrets, wattled jacana, and also in the lagoon breeding at the same time are horned screamers. And we also have striated heron and limpkin, though we have not identified nests for those. And there are also several predators that surround the area. So we've seen monkeys, we've seen a woolly monkey steal an egg from the nest, bite the end of the egg, and then empty the contents into its mouth. It's very common to see eggshells like this floating in the water underneath the breeding area. And raptors feeding on young agami, they'll steal the young from the nest and eat them on a tree nearby. And also caiman that wait in the water under the nest and eat the chicks if they fall. So the things that we have learned from this so far from the years that we've observed the colony is that the colony responds very quickly and very positively to habitat preservation. When they are not disturbed, when their eggs are not being collected, the colony expands very quickly, but the climate conditions prove to be a challenge. And if they are forced to find a new nesting area outside of unprotected areas as they were this year, then they are more vulnerable to human disturbance. We do still have questions about the relationship of the agami to the boat-billed herons and the other species that it shares its habitat with during the breeding season. And we know very, very little about where these herons go. They congregate basically to breed for a specific time of year, and then it's understood that they disperse individually into the wild. And there was a study in 2017 that says that that concluded it was possible for them to travel over 1,000 kilometers and in all different directions. So basically for us, monitoring a colony of this size required more time and resources and personnel than we could afford. So our hope is that the colony will return in the future and that we are able to amass enough funding to get more extensive counts and achieve better exhaustivity. And I think that is about my time for the presentation. Is that right, Clay?
You've got a couple of minutes left. We can take questions.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Deborah.
I will stop the share then.
I had a question. What's the literature say about the nesting habits of boat-billed herons? Are they noted nest thieves from other species in all situations?
So not in all situations, but there are, I did see a couple reports where they do reuse nests, and actually there are reports from just verbal reports, personal communication from the colony in Guyana, in French Guiana, that the boat-billed herons do reuse the agami nests.
I wonder if you could use the nesting areas of boat bills as indicators of where agamis may have been nesting 2 or 3 months previously.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Here's one from Giselle. Do the other colonies 16K and 10K away have boat-billed herons as well?
Yes, so in both of those, in the alternate colonies that they found this year, there were boat-bills and also neotropical cormorants.
Okay, oops, not here's something else in the chat. Oh, I guess that was Giselle's question. Okay, thank you very much, Deborah. You might put in a pitch about your GoFundMe page, which I often like to peruse.
Yes, thank you, Chip. Yeah, due to the pandemic, a friend started a GoFundMe for us, and it's been very helpful because we are funded by ecotourism. So during the pandemic, when there wasn't any tourism, we had a hard time. I will put our GoFundMe in the chat if you are interested in that.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's been a real challenge, but we're still working on things, and we're still there. So yeah.
How big is the reserve?
The reserve is about the area that we actually manage, because the actual land mass is bigger than what we can sort of keep an eye on.
Yeah.
So the parts that we have trails and we have direct access to is just under 2,000 hectares, about 1640.
How big would that be in terms of length and width? In terms of
Well, I can give you in acres, that's about 4,000.
4,000 and 640 acres per square mile. Okay.
And we have, actually the director of the reserve is on the call right now, and he's commenting that this year we will put camera traps to document the boat build and Agami heron situation, hopefully if they return and if the floods and everything cooperate.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Deborah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now it's time for Alberto. The next two presentations, while they may or may not contain any herons of conservation concern, both Alberto and Diego were very insistent that they have very good programs that search for herons of conservation concern. And by doing that, they also do a complete inventory of all the herons they get. So, I mean, if that's the precursor to finding that you have herons of concern, I thought it was a good pattern for other researchers to follow and to give us an idea of what you go about in trying to determine if you do have herons of concern. So that's the type of thing we'll hear from both Alberto and Diego. Alberto? Alberto's from Paraguay.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Chip and Clay, thank you very much, and congratulations for this symposium. This is great, and it's amazing to hear all the colleagues and the things that are being done globally. As Chip said, I hope that you are interested in what we are here reporting. The title of our presentation is trying to update the conservation status of a distribution of herons in Paraguay. And I have been around for more than 33 years right now. I was very active in the past, including my doctoral thesis with herons and in general with waterbirds. But I would like also to thank Tatiana Galuppi and Rebecca Irala, because those are two young researchers and very much in love with birds and especially with aquatic birds. So we are co-authors in this initiative. I don't know how much you know about Paraguay. Paraguay is in South America, and we usually say that this is a huge wetland because we are with many rivers and with many hydro resources, and except only in the northwestern part of the western part of the country, bordering Bolivia, is an area that is very dry, and it's in fact it's a dry forest. What I show you on the right are all the IBAs, the important bird areas in Paraguay. Originally 57, and they right now, as you know, all IBAs are considered KBAs, key biodiversity areas. So we are trying also at the very end, I will mention something about this, because if we are able to mainstream these important sites for conservation of biodiversity, I think that we can do really a very, very good conservation work, especially with different infrastructure. So this is a brief introduction to Paraguay. Let me tell you that we have 14 species of herons in Paraguay. We have 3 bitterns, 3 egrets, and 8 herons. So we are trying to pass a message with as much big audience as we can, that the importance of herons as bioindicators in the quality of habitats, not only in the wild and in protected areas. For example, less than 50% of all IBAs are conserved or are protected in a conservation unit. So in a country that it's more than 96% privately owned, it's very important to have the private sector very much involved. In a country also that we are heroes in producing soybean and livestock. So the private sector is important in conservation of these species. So these 14 species of herons, they can be found in diverse ecosystems in the entire country. And I would like to mention 2 special threats that we have, and it is very much monitored. And a previous colleague have also talked about that. That is the rice crops in particular. So and the threats to the wetland, but also the use of pesticides and the construction of works, especially with the Paraná-Paraguay waterway, and with the new roads that are trying to unite Brazil and Bolivia to connect the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean. So infrastructure works is something that is really a big threat now for our herons and for our aquatic birds. We don't know very much about fires. Fires have been affecting Paraguay, as many countries in South America and in Latin America. We don't know very much about what is happening with the agrochemicals that are used especially for soybean production or crop production. And we know little. And I remember last time we met, I talked something a little about climate change. But climate change, we don't have information about what's happening with herons, but we know what is happening with, for example, the change in different productive zones, or even with the changes in the different regimes with temperatures and rainfall. What we are trying to present now to you is an analysis that we are doing. We are trying to monitor as much as we can using volunteers. So later in this scientific event, on Friday, especially we are going to talk about how important is the use of citizen science to get all this information that we need. But basically, we are using at the national level the information that we have from eBird, the information that we have from WIDA Paraguay, that is a BirdLife International and IUCN partner a member in Paraguay, with information that we have, and the information that we have from the Ministry of Environment, which is almost updated, and the international level. And this is because why I asked Clay about this other link with IUCN, with the hero conservation and with the water population estimates. In short, in terms of conservation status, no heron species under any threat category at the national and international level, with all the species being recorded in the last 2 years. We have 3 species that I would like to mention. This is the rufescens tiger, the list bittern, and the little blue heron. Sorry, because usually we use many different common names in Spanish, in Guarani, and that's why we are very much linked to the scientific names, Tigrisoma lineato, Nyxobicus exilis, and Egretta cerulea. That really we don't know very much about the trend in the population of these 3 species. And the only information that we have is for the boat-built heron, that we agree, all the experts in Paraguay, that there is a decreasing trend in these populations. In terms of distribution, 5 heron species have new localities on their distributions, and are the less recorded and more range-restricted species: Ixobricus exili, Involucris, Botaurus pinato, Egretta cerulea, and again the boat-built heron. And this is the boat-built is one of the less recorded species in Paraguay, with a more range-restricted and specific habitat, most linked to streams in riparian forest. And after this presentation to you, what we are trying to really bring to the discussion, either if it's with the IUCN or with the different specialist groups that we have in the country, either if they belong or not to any specialist group, is that we need really to establish stronger conservation actions for natural habitats other than forest, because forest is in some way in South America is always when you are talking about conservation, the focus is in forest, and usually we forget about other natural habitat. This is very much linked to something that I would like to mention, that is, if we are able to integrate or mainstream waterbed and habitat in environmental standards and safeguards, especially, for example, with new standards and a standard from the World Bank group, for example, World Bank and with the International Forest Corporation, if we are able to integrate habitat conservation and species conservation in this standard 6, I think that we can in some way force either the private business or the national and subnational authorities to really begin monitoring heron populations. So trying to, though we don't have information on we don't have any species under any threat category, we are convinced, and we are trying to convince authorities that we need to monitor these common species just to keep them common, address all the environmental risk and the potential impacts on many different initiatives. Paraguay is a developing country. They are looking for foreign investments. And for example, right now we have forestation and afforestation projects, which may, if not really taken into consideration, they may affect natural habitats in particular, though they are forest area or they are grasslands areas. All of these habitats, they have aquatic environments where our herons are there. Again, the importance of strengthening national policies to adequately protect wetlands is necessary for the conservation of these species. And something that I will also talk on Friday is if we can bring the traditional knowledge. Paraguay is endowed with 19 traditional or indigenous people. If we are able, and many of these herons are messengers for them, if we can bring all this traditional knowledge to build public policies. For example, we have been able to include some of this traditional knowledge as indicators in the national determined contribution under the Paris Agreement for climate change. So we are convinced that if we can bring the traditional knowledge, we can have direct access to nature-based solutions and to ecosystem-based adaptation when the planet is right now trying to look for that information. So that's in short the presentation. I think that I have saved a lot of time for other colleagues. So these are our 14 heron species in Paraguay. Our commitment are to continue monitoring these species and trying to mainstream, integrate these species, the populations, the population levels, and the habitats in which they occur into the decision making. So thank you very much. Gracias in Spanish. Aguye is in Guarani, our official language in Paraguay. Thank you, Clay. Thank you, Chip. Thanks. I have seen Jim. They are also around. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Alberto. Okay, any questions for Alberto?
Alberto, and you're probably I think you cover this on your Friday, is it Thursday or Friday talk when you talk about engaging indigenous groups? Is that one of your talks on Friday?
I will do that. We are working with the 19 indigenous nations that we have in Paraguay. We are working directly with 5 of them. With informers, people that we are working together and bringing the information in the IWA, which is the Ethno-Ornithological Atlas. Okay. So trying to put all this information online.
Good. Well, yeah, I'll look forward to that later this week. One question I had, I know I read it in your abstract and you talked about it here. One of the questions I always have is how much is eBird used? You know, obviously it's used a lot in the United States, but I mean, is there a fair amount of eBird data and the quality of it in a place like Paraguay? I mean, you as a biologist there, do you feel like what you see on eBird represents what you think you're seeing in Paraguay?
When you don't have Clay, when you don't have much information and you don't have many people on the ground doing monitoring, eBird is a fantastic tool, and always there is a quality control, and we have many of our experts controlling the information. So yes, we think it's a very good representation of what's the real status of the numbers. And the most important thing is that we have a lot of young people, many people that are the age my age are not using eBird, but it's amazing all the young people, even they are not biologists or they are not environmentalists, but they are bird watchers and they are using this tool to upload all the information. So very useful for us.
No, that's good. I mean, because yeah, we've used it. You know, you were talking about IUCN estimates. We used eBird to at least try to convince BirdLife International and IUCN to reconsider the Reddish Egret status in Belize, because they listed 5,000 Reddish Egrets in Belize, and we used eBird to say, if there's 5,000 birds, eBird's not saying that. And we got a little bit of pushback. So I was just curious about your use of eBird.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the comment. And Tatiana and Rebecca will be with us on Friday. So they are the experts in eBird and managing and promoting many different local conservation groups to use it. So when you don't have the chance to go to remote areas, we have all these local people using this application and putting all the information there. So when you have little information, all what you have is very, very useful, of course.
Yeah.
Okay, here's another question from the chat from Sarah. Let me find it again. Have the World Migratory Bird Day activities engaged additional and young people into bird watching and reporting with eBird?
Yes. Amazing. We see in the last year how the numbers of young people are increasing using that, and sometimes there is always a competition, which many of the how do you say, very well respected ornithologists in the country or in the region are not. I don't know. I think that sometimes it's a way of a competition. But yeah, very proud of the use of that, the increase in young people using these celebrations for that. Also the census that we do on the Wetlands International or the Christmas count, which is it does not make a lot of sense here in the Southern Cone for the Christmas count, but we also use a bird Christmas count to get information from all these young people that are around all the country. Very committed.
Yes, eBird is often a competition here, as is Christmas bird counts and big days and all of those.
Right.
Where you try and get as big a daily list as you can get. Yes, I agree. It's a good fundraiser too. Birdathons.
At least we need someone of the experts that are going to control the information, but we didn't have that information 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So yeah, we now have it.
Yeah. Maybe they'll be environmental ministers 20 years down the road or 18 bird watchers.
Maybe. Remember that Cristina Morales was our first female Minister of Environment here, a colleague of Leticia Lopez. So we are having those people and those female leaders in the country.
Yes, and we had Letty up here in Canada before she was your daughter-in-law.
Yeah, right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, our time,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alberto. We're just a minute or two ahead of when Diego is supposed to speak. Diego, are you there?
Yes, hello. How are you, Chip, Clay?
Well, we're very good here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you and all of the people that are here.
Okay.
Diego, I'm going to be giving you co-host momentarily.
Thank you.
All right. Diego, you should have co-host now.
Diego's from Ecuador and is in a similar position to Alberto as far as having truly conservation concern heron species in Ecuador. But go ahead and give us your explanation and tell us your story, Diego.
Thank you very much. Should I start already?
I think you can. We're at 3:19 and according to my clock phone. Sure, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Just to be sure, you are looking at only one slide, right?
Yes.
Perfect. So first of all, thank you very much, Chief Clay, and everybody that is here for this opportunity to present the work that we have been developing on herons. I've always loved herons, but it was not until I finished my PhD and had all these massive data, similar to what Alberto was saying, that I was able to finally have some time to start to analyze the data that I have compiled. And this is a work in progress. So I'm going to give you an overview of our information that we have compiled about the diversity, biogeography, and conservation of herons in Ecuador. And this work has been a collaboration with one of my former students and now colleague, Emilia Peña Herrera. We are both from Universidad San Francisco de Quito, from the Museum of Zoology, which is in Quito, Ecuador. First, how did we compile all of our data? First, we did a systematic lead review, including journals and also great literature, which for Ecuador proved out to be very important to get heron data, obtaining information both in Spanish and in English. And of course, as you should expect, there are very few studies, extremely few studies. Most of the data actually comes from field guides. If you have seen the book of Birds of Ecuador by Bob Richley and Paul Greenfield, it's probably one of the most exhaustive source for data of herons, and also an unpublished document that was published by a former ornithologist from Ecuador. He did it in 1980, and that's all there it is. Then there are small published papers here and there reporting some information about the geography or the breeding biology. And there's nothing else actually about most herons of Ecuador. And interestingly, there is basically no information on local and traditional indigenous Afro-Ecuadorian or mestizo knowledge. So it's not just scientific information that we're lacking, it's also locally relevant information. What we did is we create and curated a heron national dataset. Currently, it has over 93,000 locality points. And how we got this information? Well, from fieldwork that we have been doing since 1988 to the present, and mainly collaborating with ABC Conservación, BirdLife Partner in Ecuador, and my university, through different citizen science tools and activities, including BioBlitz, census, including the wetland bird census, the Christmas bird count, and strongly using eBird and iNaturalist. And as you were mentioning before, the data from eBird and iNaturalist are very good, but it requires very close curation, but not as close curation as GBIF. GBIF actually has a lot more dirty data that actually citizen science tools. We collected information from national museums and from international museums thanks to GBIF, and of course, every single locality data that we were able to collect from the systematic lead review that I mentioned to you before. Just to give you an idea, because I'm going to talk a lot about the geographic regions of Ecuador, mainland Ecuador is divided into two regions. Insular Ecuador, which I'm sure that you have heard, the famous Galapagos Islands, which is an oceanic archipelago about 900 meters away on the Pacific Ocean, away from the mainland Ecuador, and mainland Ecuador, which is divided into three regions: the Pacific coastlands, the Andean highlands, and the Amazonian lowlands. And I have circled the two main cities of Ecuador, the capital city on the north, which is Quito, and the largest port, which is Guayaquil. And I will call your attention for these cities because you will see that actually most of the data that we have about herons from the coast and the highlands, they are biased because most observers are in these cities, and those are the main regions that records are coming from, while other areas are in some cases almost empty of records. I'm sorry. Too fast. So what we know about the herons in Ecuador, in terms of the species richness, we have 23 species in total, 18 on the Amazonian lowlands, 15 on the Pacific lowlands, 11 on the Andes, and 11 on the Galapagos Islands. You can see encircle the area. So that's the entire database with all the 93,000 points all plotted into mainland Ecuador. I have excluded for some analysis Galapagos, but you can see that there are areas where almost nothing is known about even which heron is there. And the situation in the southern Amazonia is quite worrisome because almost no data is available for some of the best protected forests. They are not national parks, they are not protected areas, are indigenous community lands. Also from central and southern Andes, very few records, despite having some of the most important wetlands in the Andean highlands. And central lowlands of Pacific coast are also very little known. In mainland Ecuador, we have records of 22 species, including one endemic taxon. And also, like Alberto, I'm so used of speaking the Latin names, so I'm going to give most of the times Latin names. In some cases, I have put the English names for your reference. So the endemic taxon is Ixobricus exilis limoncoche. We have one boreal migrant, which is the green heron, 3 vagrant species, the gray blue heron, the whistling heron, and the reddish egret, with very, very few records, especially for the last 2. And one unvouchered species, the striped back bittern, which only has 1 record that it has remained unconfirmed. For insular Ecuador, so for the Galapagos Islands, we have 11 species, which include 2 endemic taxa, and the lava heron, which depending on the taxonomy is either a subspecies or a different species, and Ardea aerodias cognata. The same migratory boreal species. And interestingly, the community of herons in Galapagos is fluctuating a lot and is changing in recent years. For example, for 3 species, the cattle egret, the black crowned night heron, and the snowy egret, we have seen establishment of breeding populations in recent years. And we have 2 vagrant species, the tricolor heron and the little blue heron, that are vagrant, but are becoming more and more common and probably will establish breeding populations anytime soon. I'm going to show you a few of the maps that we have been able to compile just to show you some examples. And this is the case of the most common species, Bubulcus ibis and Butoroides striata. And I call your attention for the yellow arrows. In the case of Bubulcus ibis, you can see the huge concentration of records around Quito. And that's basically a bias because of the amount of bird watchers and ornithologists working in this area. Although if you go to some other places across the entire coastland and in some deforested areas of the Amazonian lowlands, is going to be almost everywhere. And in the case of Butoroides striata, you can see that there are some spots that almost follow patterns of lines. Those are because most of records come either from roads or from big rivers. But we have very few information from some natural areas that are not next to roads or from small wetlands, including small rivers. We have some other abundant species, but that have more established patterns, like for example, Ardea alba and Ardea cocoi, which are not so widespread as the previous species. And we have some other species that are extremely restricted in their distribution. For example, Egretta tricolor, that is basically along the coastal lines with very few records inland, or Botaurus pinnatus, that is just restricted to extremely few wetlands that are all endangered, as I will tell you in a few minutes. Then we have these species that do not show a clear pattern. For example, in the case of Ixobricus exilis, basically it shows almost everywhere in the country. We have 2 records near Quito that no one is very sure to which subspecies they belong or where do they come from. They may be coming from an undiscovered breeding population in some of the wetlands of northern Ecuador. We have another probably Peruvianus subspecies in the coastlands, and we have some records that probably correspond to migrant or vagrant subspecies in the Amazonian lowlands. And to the right, in the case of Tigrosoma fasciatum, I just present this map to show you the importance of curating data, because all of those records from the Amazonian lowlands are actually not from these species, but have been used in several analysis by the Ministry of Environment and some other non-governmental and governmental organizations to plot the distribution of these species. So this is just a word of caution that whenever we use this kind of data, and it has been very clear for Ecuador, and I've seen tons of papers saying the same for other parts of the world, we have to be very careful and not just using the data directly as they come. Then for the threatened species, as you can see, they are not so restricted. Actually, in Ecuador, we have some other species that have more restricted range, but you can see that in both cases, records are mostly concentrated on the northern part of the Amazonian lowlands. But this seemed to be actually a bias because of the very few surveys happening in the southern part of the Amazonian lowlands, as I showed you before. And for example, in the case of Sebrilus undulatus, you can see actually here that there are a few localities starting to show up in the south. Those are all recent, and those are all coming from young birders and ornithologists that are starting to visit these areas. When we see data about the threatened herons in Ecuador, we have two species that are globally threatened, Agami heron and the zigzag heron, the one that I just showed you. One is threatened, the other is neither threatened. Their populations, especially for zigzag heron, is not a very abundant species, but there are some specific stations and lodges that are actually famous because you can go there and almost for sure see the zigzag heron. While for the Agami heron, especially the Yasuni National Park is the best place. And recently, a new rockery was discovered, and soon a paper is going to be published, not by me, but by park rangers of the Yasuni National Park that have been monitoring this new breeding colony. At the national level, between 2015 and 2019, I was part of the group of specialists that was evaluating all of the species of birds from Ecuador in order to do national IUCN assessments. It was recently published, the Lista Roja de las Aves del Ecuador, the red list for birds of Ecuador in 2019. And at the national level, we have 6 species that are threatened. These include, of course, the globally threatened species, but also Botaurus pinnatus and 3 populations from the Galapagos Islands, including 2 endemic subspecies and 1 non-endemic but native population that is extremely reduced. And we have 2 near-threatened species, which is Tigrosoma fasciatum and the lava heron Butyroides sunevali. If we see these data in terms of the protected areas, we have extremely few protected areas that are well representing wetlands, important wetlands, and species. Galapagos, 90% of it is a national park, so it's the best protected area for herons and our wetlands. But in terms of mainland, basically we have only 4 protected areas that are supporting good populations of herons and important wetlands. Those are 2 in the northern Amazonian lowlands, Cuyabeno and Yasuni National Park, and in the coastal areas, the Machalilla and Manglares Churute protected areas. While the southern Amazonian lowlands, Andean highlands, and Pacific lowlands, either their protected areas are poorly represented in the records, so we know very little of the herons that are present there, or there are no protected areas in some of the most important wetlands of Ecuador. And 2 examples, 2 very sad examples of these are La Cegua, which is probably one of the most important, one of the largest wetlands in northern coastline Ecuador. It has a huge amount of waterbirds. It has huge populations, including some of the nationally threatened species. However, the rate of destruction is rampant. Although there have been some conservation strategies and initiatives by local government, it is a Ramsar site, but the destruction it has not been controlled and is increasing. And I think that in the next decade, we may lose this wetland as it is right now. And the Yaguarcocha lagoon in the highlands of Ecuador, which is extremely contaminated by fertilizers, pesticides, and gray and black waters from nearby urban areas. In terms of the conservation of herons in Ecuador, habitat, wetlands loss, plus their pollution, and introduced species are some of the main threats. The drivers are basically agriculture, aquaculture, and urban expansion. Despite very strict laws that control the hunt and affectation of rockeries and of herons, individual herons, illegal hunting and human heron conflicts have been increasing, especially over the last few years. In the institute of the university where I work, we also manage the wildlife hospital. And when we compare the data that we have since 2012 up to the present, in the last few years, the amount of conflicts between humans and herons, basically because of expansion of urban areas to very attractive, beautiful wetlands, has produced a lot of rockeries to be destroyed and a lot of the babies ending up in the wildlife hospital. Another problem that is a bit more localized, but is affecting some populations, unfortunately, some of the breeding colonies, are roadkills. This is the case of roadkills in Galapagos, in areas that are nearby important rockeries for some of the endemic subspecies, but the same is happening in the Amazonian lowlands, in the highlands, and in the Pacific coastlands. So this was a very brief and quick overview of the work that we are doing. We still have lots of data to analyze. We have still to compile some more information, especially checking some of the older literature to try to understand how the heron populations have been changing. But we hope to be able to publish this pretty soon. And thank you very much for this opportunity. If you have questions, please let me know.
Okay, thank you very much, Diego. I don't see any questions in the chat. I might pose a question to you, just like Alberto had. To what extent are you trying to utilize indigenous knowledge about heron distribution or heron populations? Have you gotten to that stage yet, or is it still something on your to-do list?
Yes, actually, we are doing, of course, very localized, because it requires an intensive field work. Because we need to go and we have been doing participatory observation and in-depth polls in Galapagos and in Afro-Ecuadorian communities of coastline Ecuador. And interestingly, is very, very large the amount of knowledge that they have, and the participation of herons in their cosmovision, especially for Afro-Ecuadorian communities that are far older than the Galapagos human communities. The Galapagos people only settled there around the mid-1800s, while the Afro-Ecuadorian communities arrived to the coastline of Ecuador due to slavery in the 1600s. So the amount of participation of herons in the cosmovision of Afro-Ecuadorian people is far larger, and they have a very close link between herons, especially rockeries, and the health of their wetlands.
Okay, okay. The chat. We have Giselle asks, at the national level, you have a Ardea herodias as a threatened species. Is the species resident in Ecuador?
Yes, at the national level, we have the subspecies from Galapagos. Only the subspecies from Galapagos, which has a low population. This was a very large discussion because it's not a rare species. You can actually see it in some of the main ports of Galapagos. However, the population is very low, and data from the Charles Darwin Station censuses show a bit of a decline. So that's why this species, because of the combination of factors, plus the declines that we already seen in some other seabirds, was classified as vulnerable.
Okay. Well, we've got a couple minutes. Yes.
No, I would like to congratulate Diego. I very much like this country focus, and especially including the Galapagos, which are so important for bird conservation. So we need to find a way in future initiatives, Chip and Clay, on how we can try to, I don't know, work at the national level and see how, for example, what can Diego do with Deborah, working together with these visions in Peru and Ecuador that are bordering country, and for sure that they share a lot of transboundary ecosystems. So no, just to say thank you very much, Diego.
Gracias, Alberto. And it's very important. For example, for the Agami heron, the new rockery is basically on the border with Peru. So if we want to understand what's the biology of the rockery, we need to work between both countries.
How big is that rookery?
I haven't seen the paper published yet. I am a member of the board of the journal that is publishing it, so I've seen part of the abstract, but I haven't seen yet the full paper.
Yes. Well,
Yeah.
yes, I found these two presentations very interesting as well. I mean, maybe the stage is being set for a meeting in South America on, you know, heron distribution, heron populations in the countries of South America.
Would be great. Ready to receive you here in Paraguay now that the pandemic is slowing down.
Yeah.
As you know, there are a lot of triggers on international waters when you are working on different projects. I would like to see something like this or international sites important for conservation of birds or herons. So these are good inputs for future discussions. Thank you.
Well, here's something in the chat. The rookery that was reported at Yasuni had a nest count of 90 nests in 2017. Is that the one on the border, Diego?
Yes, it probably is. Thank you, Deborah. Yes, it's
Okay.
probably the one in the border of the eastern border of Yasuni.
Yeah, so 90 nests is a reasonable number. It's not 15,000, but it's better than one or two. Okay, yes.
I see that Jim wants to say something. Look at his face. He's so silent.
You're about to hear more from me than you want to, Alberto.
I don't see his, oh, there it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
he's there.
That will lead us into the next presentation, and that's Jim Cushlan giving us a wrap up of, hey, Jim, what do you think of all these talks, and what do you think of what's going on with herons of worldwide conservation concern? Take it away.
Need to share my screen.
Yeah, Jim, apologize. I'm pulling it up right now. All right, Jim, you should be co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, ready to go?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for asking me to do a little generalization and summary of the great things that we've heard today. And I want to thank all of the participants and organizers and up to the 73 people who joined us at various parts of the day. It's been really, really fantastic. All right, next. Okay, there we go. So we have a great advantage in heron conservation because most of our species are not threatened. They're very flexible in their habits and habitats. They're long-lived, and so their life history emphasizes adult survivorship. And I just put that in there relative to questions about the white-bellied heron and when you disturb nests and so forth. Those species are very easily abandon their nests so as to live for another day. And they're very resilient. They accommodate to natural and human-caused changes. So it's interesting, what proportion of species are threatened? We really don't know because we don't know the number of species. Here are some examples, 62, 65, 63. No doubt the number is higher. The great white heron has just been recognized by IUCN as an independent species and an endangered one at that. So when we get some biochemical analyses, we're going to find that there are more species, particularly island species, than we know now. But generally, we have 50 non-threatened species. And the great thing is that for these, conservation can be embedded in more encompassing activities like big initiatives and protection and wetlands of international importance, parks and protected areas, schemes like we just heard about in Australia, important bird areas. Over 900 IBAs have been identified as important to herons. The list is on our website. If even a small proportion of these were being managed for their wetlands, that is how we can assure the survival of most of these species. So here's our 13 species of greatest concern that we've been working on through the day. From critically endangered to non-threatened. and they can fall into some categories. For example, the large herons. The white-bellied heron we just heard, it's lucky to get a fish or two a day, and they have high energy demands. So to be a large heron it's tough to get enough food. Night herons should not be overlooked because 4 of our 5 recently exterminated species were island forms of night herons. And then we have our island herons itself that are at risk. And I think when the taxonomy is done, we're going to have quite a few more species of herons that are confined to islands. We just heard about the Galapagos that has 3 species or subspecies that are distinctive there. Forest herons, we have several species of forest herons on our list, and these are difficult because they are so difficult to census and to monitor. They occur sparsely over wide areas of forest. They're hard to find. We know very little about them. They're very hard to get to know. And then we have coastal herons that are in environments that are threatened and are hard to live in because of the water quality, either being polluted or being too clear for easy foraging. So they fall into a number of say ecological categories. Here are the species that are faced with habitat loss. Nearly all of them, all but the forest herons. Time and time again, we find out that either a natural habitat limitation or loss of that habitat or change of that habitat is the most significant impact on heron populations. So here are the species that we were fortunate enough to hear about today. Hopefully in additional symposia, we're going to be able to hear about some of the other species. And I do want to talk a little bit about how we go about planning and analyses for heron conservation. And one of the important purposes of the Heron Specialist Group is to do these global reviews. So over the years, we've reviewed the conservation aspects of herons, the biology, came up with a global action plan, worked with the IUCN on its red listing, and put all of this information available on our website. And this has great value. It gives us a common basis of understanding. We can synthesize things and analyze them globally. We can identify priority actions. And the importance of that is that these can become project justifications. So if in a global plan, we say that this is important and needs to be done, then someone who would like to do that study or do that conservation action can appeal to the plan to say, hey, look, this is important and justifies my project. But all this planning and analyses doesn't result in action or in funding. It's helpful in the background, but it's not going to do anything in terms of heron conservation itself. And it's immediately out of date as soon as it gets in publication. I do want to mention that the biology and the action plan is now possible to update continuously online by group members. And it's just a matter of being able to organize that and having leadership and the capacity to curate and manage. But group members themselves can update the species accounts, become the author of those accounts, get their projects in a priority list globally, and that can all be done remotely. So beyond the global initiatives and planning, it also takes place at regional, national, and species levels. And we've seen all of those today in various presentations. Oops, going the wrong way. So here are a few of the regional multinational initiatives: North American Waterbird Conservation Plan, the African Eurasian Migratory Plan, the East Asian Australian Flyway Initiative, which is now about 20 years old, but it has just announced a partnership for a $2 billion engagement in conservation along that flyway. So these are incredibly important that waterbirds, that herons are at the table and that the priorities are being recognized. And so working within these multinational initiatives is very, very important so that herons are not overlooked. And national analyses. So we've just had two extremely interesting presentations on Ecuador and Paraguay. These are some of the results of those presentations. We've determined better what the range and status is, their threat analyses, and it all comes together at a national basis because it's the country that's really responsible for the conservation of its species. And really, these national analyses should be a high priority for the Heron Specialist Group. The Ecuador and Paraguay talks are two good examples. They can, these are the sort of things that can be published in our journal, on our online journal. And I think it'd be a fantastic thing to start encouraging national experts to do their national analyses and have them published. I keep hitting the wrong button. There we go. But when it actually comes down to conservation, when a species becomes threatened or endangered and needs special attention, it really needs the attention of a single species conservation initiative, because these can be targeted to specific risks. They have champions. It's easy to champion a species rather than a group of species. There's national level engagement because these species can be seen as the patrimony of the country and they really care. And endangered species funding can be made available because they are listed as threatened. And so these single species conservation initiatives are incredibly important if we really want to keep these species from going extinct. So we heard two presentations from Madagascar, which is an area that we have to give much attention to because of the serious ecological issues there. There's an international single species plan for the pond heron. We heard about the update on that. There's no plan yet for Madagascar heron, but these activities created extensive surveys, identified the monitoring needs, examined historic range determinations and habitat preferences. In both cases, we've got a little over 1,000 birds and they're declining, one more rapidly than the other. And the risks are being understood as disturbance in hunting and woodland conversion and so forth. The interesting thing in these two studies that suggest that in Madagascar, these risks really will be affecting all 11 wetland-dependent herons, including an endemic subspecies. I just said Reddish Egret, that purple heron. That's pretty good for the Reddish Egret. They go to Madagascar. This endemic subspecies of the purple heron. And so if we can use these flagship species and develop conservation activities around them, we will also be positively affecting the other species of herons in Madagascar. So what we've heard about in large part today are the results of species-specific interests of champions, of people who have developed a particular interest and concern for these species. So the first one we've highlighted is a very successful case history of species initiative for the Reddish Egret. And Clay went through a very interesting analyses of how they came about where they are now and maybe some of the dead ends they took. But it follows a pattern and maybe it's a very good model, I think, for our working groups. It starts with a meeting of interested parties who get together and decide that they've got enough in common and care and they want to move forward. This one focused on surveys initially, and that led to establishing a working group and a conservation action plan. And this particular initiative started from a research perspective and has always maintained a research perspective, and has, because of that, been able to move very firmly in identifying conservation units and targets. Sometimes the research and conservation gets disjointed, but this is an example where research led to conservation. And then there's the need for for continued communications and meeting and network building. And this is also a very good case history, how over time that network has built to where you can revise the range-wide conservation plan and even have business plans for the subunits, conservation subunits. So there's a lot to be said, to be learned here. And you might also note that this group followed a very specific planning regime and brought in external experts to help them out, and also had an important conservation planning research grant that helped them through. So anyway, this I think is a really good case history. Very exciting case history is our white-bellied heron working group, which started with the rediscovery after decades and decades of not having observed or reported the species, that it was rediscovered. And this led to interest and concern and a conservation strategy workshop that was brought together by institutional support, international institutional support, and national institutional support. Everybody got on board and decided that this was something that really was worthwhile and needed to be done. And from this workshop came a working group and a global conservation strategy, and then follow-up workshops that led to additional range state engagements. And so this takes a lot of energy to keep the group moving forward and in communication, but this was provided by champions and individuals who care a great deal about this species as a conservation issue. And so this activity has been put together with a kind of a matrix of grant and private and government and NGO support, and now has decided that it needs to secure its long-term financial stability through an endowment, which is kind of unique in our thinking, but clearly an excellent way to go, particularly when you have a facility to manage. This is also an example of how citizen science data and getting out and doing the very difficult surveys, basic research and public awareness have all come together to develop the approaches to conservation of the species across several countries. And has settled into three areas of conservation: conserving the heron's habitat, the in situ conservation, a captive breeding program because the species is so rare. A captive breeding program is almost a last-ditch effort, and that is exactly where we are with this species. And then building the conservation of this heron into landscape planning, which is now going on, and now we have a new action plan. So this too is an excellent example of how people have come together and done what they could and tried to move forward. And the RSPB has done a fantastic job of taking the leadership within Bhutan and developing the captive breeding facility that's going to be so essential to the species' future. A third case history is the Agami heron. This too kind of started with research, which actually overturned our prior understanding of the species. This was a species, you can read my book, this was a species that's found dispersed around through the Amazon rainforest. No, it isn't. It gathers in these humongous colonies and then can spread out, as was mentioned, to 1,000 kilometers away for the non-breeding season. So we did not understand the basic biology of this species. And once it's identified, then the need is identified because clearly it's an issue of colony site protection. So a working group was established, a conservation plan was developed. This had institutional funding from Europe through French Guiana. And this conservation plan was able to set priorities, develop standard methods, and begin the networking that's essential for this species. And determine what was needed. And as I mentioned, colony site protection, roles of disturbance and weather, This is a species that if you can protect its major colonies, you've gone a long way in its conservation. However, unlike the previous case histories, there's been an insecurity of institutional support. Institutions have stepped up and then had to step back for one reason or another. And so moving forward with the working group has been limited by a lack of devoted financial resources and human resources. Hopefully, we will see additional advances coming forth under Deborah's leadership, but it has been a challenge, and it's been a challenge because of the lack of dedicated resources. Slaty egret is a fourth case. There was clearly identification of need for this range-restricted species, and there was international funding for initial planning support, and this created the Single Species Conservation Action Plan. It identified the threats in this limited range of hydrologic schemes and wetland conversion, and the needs for monitoring and research, and the suggestion to establish a working group. Stephanie just went through a new review, an excellent review. Hopefully that paper will be published because it's very, very thorough. We now know we've got several thousand birds, but still restricted to a very small part of Africa. And in a habitat that's incredibly difficult of access, and there's limited in-country infrastructure devoted to species like the heron. And there has been limited dedicated funding, just like the Agami heron. So the working group was not established. Those that have cared about the species have tried to move forward with their analyses. Steph did a fantastic job of this review, trying to find new colonies, trying to get to those colonies. But it's the conservation Slaty egret is lacking this dedicated oversight and funding to move forward in the way that it should. The Australian bittern is our fifth case history of a conservation initiative. We know our status is about 2,000 birds now in Australia, New Zealand, and declining. And the issues are natural wetlands, and particularly Murray Darling and rice fields. And here's a conservation focus that is on habitat. But what Matt is able to show us was the value of public communications and getting out and engaging the habitat management communities and the farm agricultural communities and trying to make this a species of concern for the nation, for the region, for the farmers. There's a role of climate change in this species. There's a need for bittern-friendly water management. I love the idea of bittern-friendly rice. So this is a conservation initiative that shows the value of engaging widely the agricultural community, the consumer community, and to some extent, Australia as a whole, that this is a species that it could care about. This is also an example that might give us time to think about that there are 4 of these species of Great Britons, kind of one per continent. They have similar habitat requirements. They're all suffering with difficulties. In North America, there's been engagement over the last 10 years in monitoring in Europe on reed bed management, which is in conflict with the bittern. South America, very limited information on their bittern. So I wonder, since there's there are successes around the globe in engaging with the great bittern conservation. This may be, the time might well be ripe for a great bittern working group, so that those people who are accomplishing these things around the world can maybe help them get together and be able to learn from each other more easily than it is at present. So what works? We've had decades now of thinking about and attempting heron conservation. And I think these case histories have, and our experience over the last 30, 40 years have really pinned down what works. First of all, is a recognition of status, that there's a conservation issue with a species or with a subspecies or with a population. It doesn't need to be species, but there's a conservation issue with a heron. And then someone has to step up and champion this species or subspecies or population and be willing to devote the time and energy and resources to bring together interest groups that might also be concerned about this species. And this usually begins with a conference or meetings, communications, getting to know each other, kind of setting up a common agenda, and if it's appropriate, to establish a formal working group. It's amazing how these working groups have been successful, but they're all similar because they've kind of developed from within. People care about this species. They want to get together and do something for its conservation. But having established a working group, then that's kind of an impetus to continue on and continue engagement and to continue moving forward. It can't be done by volunteers alone. There needs to be institutional support, whether these are grants or contracts or just, a university professor who has their salary and has a project that is appreciated by the institution, by a nature reserve, by some level of institution that will continue to support the person involved. And at some point, there has to be salaried participants. It just can't happen on the basis of volunteers alone. Volunteers are incredibly important, but somebody has to be able to fit this into their day. Creating a range-wide conservation action plan becomes essential, not only for the plan, but for the process, because that is what gets people together and talking and planning and thinking. And to some extent, the process is as important or more important than the plan, because the plan's going to get old, but the process won't. And we identify the research and monitoring and trends and all of those things that we need and actions in order to further the conservation of the species, and that's identified in the plan. And then it has to step down into bits and pieces that it can actually be accomplished. Some of this will require securing project grant funding. You need money, and we need to find ways to access funding from whatever source we can, whether it's multinational initiatives or local funding or online funding. But we clearly need funding. And that working group, the people who care, the species champions, the institutions need to be nurtured over time, need to be kept connected, and develop in the capacity of the working group developing over time to meet the specific needs. So those are some thoughts on the symposium. Congratulations to everybody. It was absolutely fantastic. And I'll turn it over to Clay and Chip.
Well, thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. Chip, you went off mute. You went on mute. You're mute again, Jim. Or Chip, sorry.
Okay. A tremendous wrap up, Jim. Sorry it's taken me so long to figure out the mute button. But just the kind of thing I was hoping we could get from you. So much appreciated. Your insight is wonderful.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, thank you, Jim, and again, Chip, for organizing all this and all the speakers. Now we're kind of in a phase where basically kind of open it up for any questions from any of the speakers, thoughts on what Jim shared with us, anything about the Heron group. I do want to make one plug in case people are dropping off and suffering from Zoom fatigue. I got all that, but just a reminder, the Waterbird meeting continues this week, and tomorrow from 12 to 13:40, again, that's Eastern Standard Time, US Coast, obviously. There's a career panel that's been organized, and they're going to have many folks, I think 21 panelists from various sectors, basically talk about different career opportunities and what's it like in the private sector, the federal sector, or whatever. And it's going to include a Latin American panel, which will be entirely in Spanish. So just encourage you to look on Drifta, look for that opportunity. That's a great thing that the society's put together and all the people behind bringing these panelists together. So just wanted to say that before people dropped off. Now back to Herons. So I just want to open it up to anybody that, you know, I think Jim had a lot of thought-provoking comments, certainly that resonated with me. But I want to open it up to anybody that has questions about anything. Or for previous speakers.
I tell you what, Clay, let me ask you. I proposed the Reddish Egret experience to be something of a model. Tell us how it might be a model and how it might not be a model.
Oh, okay. That's a good question. I think okay, I got to think about this one. So I think it's a model. I think it's a model in how to, and a couple things. I don't want to sound like I'm tooting my own horn at all, but I think, Jim, what you said is something we've definitely strived to do, and that is to have research be very much tied to the conservation planning. And then I gave a seminar last week at Iowa State, and it was about, I was trying to put together the last 20 years of work, and the talk was a little bit jumpy, but it was trying to say that these things don't happen independently. While we're doing research, we're networking, and while we're networking, we're conservation planning, but then we're also doing the next step in research and trying to pull that information together. And so I do think that having research tied with conservation is very important. Of course, I'm an academic. I say that because I enjoy research, but I do believe they need to be very closely coupled. And I think they both benefit, right? Both benefit from each other, research and conservation. And I found too that it expanded our network, right? I needed to do surveys in the Bahamas. And then, so I was doing surveys, and there I'm finding people on the ground doing work that know the local threats, right? And know the local status much more than I do from afar. So I think in those ways it worked. And I think, you know, if you can secure the funds for a trained facilitator that can really keep you on track and be that person that, like you said, that's their day job, for all the webinars that we did leading up to our workshops, and then all the webinars we did following them, having that point person that's their day job, that's what they're getting paid to do, is very beneficial. I would say where it hasn't worked, and I'm hoping that will change, is we still don't have a dedicated person who's necessarily, let's say, a percentage of their time is to implement the plan. I guess that would be me, just because I'm tenured and I really can't go above full professor. And so it's where my passions lie. And so I'm going to do everything in my power to implement the plan over the next 10 years. But we would benefit greatly from someone who's literally, you know, I think of Anna, right, as an example with the Agami group. And I think of Gemma and others, and certainly Indra and many others, but someone that part of their day job is being paid to manage a working group or to help facilitate it. That's where I think we are still lacking. And that's, I think, something that worries me about, you know, implementing this plan, and where are we going to be 5 and 10 years from now. And, you know, it's something that I know Jonah asked the question, we were on the break, not everybody was on, but, you know, how do we, you know, how do you build support for a species or a region or whatever? I think for us, it's just been constantly champion Reddish Egrets, right? And anytime there's a discussion about anything that remotely could relate to a Reddish Egret, we're there trying to provide that voice. And I think it's just sort of having to be that squeaky wheel. And that's what's, you know, Jim, you mentioned the funding, right? The Fish and Wildlife Service funding, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation funding. Those were unsolicited on our part, in the sense that the foundations or the Fish and Wildlife reached out to us and said, you know, like Ian Davidson, and said, hey, I like Reddish Egrets. I want you to submit a proposal to us. That doesn't happen very often, but I think it's because, Jim, I know you've certainly been a champion of our working group, but it's people out there, you know, championing it, and I think it makes a real difference. Alberto.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I was watching and paying a lot of attention to Jim's presentation. And I don't know if because of my work during the last years, but I think that still there is a niche that we have not really, we are not working with. We have herons, or we have aquatic birds, and we are working with wetlands, and we are not telling that message to the decision makers. And I have seen that since from Mexico to Argentina, that if we can show, for example, in the impact environmental assessments, if we can show how important are these indicators linked to the wetlands, I think that we can have much more information for the decision making in general, but also they are clear indicators of habitat change. Of course, if it's with pesticides or with herbicides, this is much more important. But in general terms, recently I was involved in DNA analysis, environmental DNA. And I was surprised that I was expected to have in the water samples many birds and aquatic birds and fish. They were amazing species that we didn't know that they were there. They appear in the environmental DNA analysis. Of course, it's very, 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 very expensive. But also, you mentioned during the different presentations the potential of using, for example, drones for monitoring. So I don't know. I think that we perhaps in the future, Jim, Clay, and Chip, perhaps we need to have a meeting with the business and trying to show how relatively easy is to get this information and how relatively easy is to take decision for conservation. If we link these sites that we have scientific information. So it is not only when we talk about critical habitats, we not only talk about protected areas. There is a lot of more information. For example, in the KBA database, all the information on areas that are important because of the scientific knowledge are jumped together into this standard number 6 that I usually mention. So I don't know, just to share with you that I think that there is a room for us to really have a little more political impact, perhaps. Thank you.
No, I agree. Thank you, Alberto. Kate?
Thanks. I'm really interested in what you're saying, Alberto. I was just going to ask if you could talk a little bit more about why you think there is that gap between research and application. Is it because of where your funding comes from to do the research that you're not hooked into the networks of the folks making management or policy decisions, or what is the barrier in implementation?
My feeling is that our authorities are much more inclined in seeing either, I don't know, flagship species or very much focused on a species, and only if there is a huge wetlands that are going to be affected by a particular, or even they talk about the benefit for waterbirds when they are creating, for example, because of the hydroelectric dams, they are creating artificial lakes. And sometimes even it's a conflict with me inside. So yes, they are right. They are creating more habitat, but I don't know if they are changing the habitat. So this is not, perhaps we have more, I don't know, perhaps more great egrets, great white egrets, but perhaps we are affecting the habitat for other species that are less common. So my feeling is that we need a more comprehensive view in terms of the landscape and in terms of the sites. And of course, the species focus is very important. The population focus is very important, but the combination as I don't know. That's why because that's why I talk about that. And also I think that Diego presentation about the assemblages of species that are in one particular site. Sometimes my feeling is that we are very much focused on one species and then we lose the entire picture. That's why I also insist, let's do what we are supposed to be doing for specific species, but don't forget that the species that are common, we need to secure that they continue being common. So I don't know, it's just sharing with you this. Thank you.
That's really helpful, thanks.
Yeah, I have, Matt, do you have something to share?
Yeah, look,
Please.
Thank you to, thanks Clay, and huge thanks to you and Chip and Jim. I loved your presentation and I really like the idea of a great bitten working group. I'm just, oh, sorry, I've got kids. I got kids.
Quite all right.
It's nearly time to go to
bring
school.
Them to the conversation. They're important. They're the future.
Yeah, yes. No, I was just wondering, here in Australia, we have recovery plans, and they're for our nationally threatened species. And I'm just wondering how these working groups might fit in with that.
Oh, to have young ones again instead of cranky teenagers. So make sure I understand, Matt. So you're saying, tell me what you mean by recovery plan. I mean, I think I know, like you're talking about like an endangered species sort of recovery plan. No, he's talking to the kids.
Oops, we lost him momentarily.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. So
yeah, well, I'm just wondering how it can fit in. So we write recovery plans for nationally threatened species, and you know, I'm hesitant to double up, but I'm just wondering how they can complement each other and how you think that might work. Has that worked well with the other ones?
well, I mean, I'll give you my answer, but I mean, I think for the species that I've worked on, right, it's typically we have a conservation plan because it's not, you know, in the US, a federally threatened and endangered species, right? So I've worked with, you know, black-capped vireos, right, songbirds that are threatened or endangered. They've got their own recovery plan. That gives us our direction. So for us, at least in the US, it's been species plans like little blue herons or reddish egrets. It's because they're not federally threatened or endangered, and so we pull people together. To me, I don't think you want to duplicate it, right? If there's a recovery plan for the Australasian bittern, that is your plan, and then the group that comes together to implement that plan, that to me is sort of your working group. I mean, that's sort of my thoughts.
Thanks, Clay.
I'm wondering, is Steph Tyler still on? Steph?
I see you're there.
Yeah, but maybe not there.
Well, while we're seeing if she comes, Jorge, I know you messaged me. You were trying to, Jorge, if you're there, please, Jorge Carrera, feel free to come off mute. I think he was trying to talk.
All right.
Hola, Jorge.
Hello to everyone. Well, I am impressed with Alberto's work and the work in. Sorry, I'm going to take this notes. Cannot speak. Oh, sorry. With the work in Ecuador at this national level, and I was wondering how difficult it would be to do something similar to Mexico. I think Conavio is having some work on that. It wouldn't be that difficult to do some mapping with the eBird. In Mexico, we know that as a Averaves. So pretty much of that work is I could say is kind of done. And then I was thinking that we have very different situations in the northern part of Mexico and the southeastern part of Mexico. Southeastern part is where the water is. So in the northern part, in Chihuahua, Nuevo León, they are more used to do docks unlimited kind of projects of water management or ponds, rehabilitation, something like that. But in the rest of in southeastern Mexico, we went creating large protected areas without going specifically into one species. So we created the Pantanos de Centla and Laguna de Términos, Los Petenes in Campeche, Siancán, so very large. I'm talking about millions of hectares of coastal wetlands protected. And we think that now we have that, and we are in the point of going to work to really know within these areas what do we really have and how the systems work, and then we try to understand some more specific relations between these areas. Because, for instance, I have observed several times when there is a lot of rain in the eastern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, so it is too flooded for the good storks to nest and other egrets to find food. They will move to the western part, to the Sumacinta Delta, and they will find the appropriate places. So we really need to work on that regional level to understand the movements, the alternatives they have. And I am sure, as Jim Kuzlan said, the birds, the herons live several years. And I know that they are very intelligent and they know the region. So they can really read the situation and go to a place that could be hundreds of kilometers apart, but is still within their own region. So I think that at least for reddish egrets, the agamias here, some other species, we need to work on at that level, not going really to the species. Well, I mean, going to understand the movement of the species and groups of the species. Thank you.
Thanks, Jorge. Yeah, and you know, with that and thinking about what Alberto said, you know, I think, you know, Alberto, one approach we've had with the reddish egret is that maybe that's the species we're championing, but one of the things we've developed, the Mexico business plan did it, the US plan did it, the business plan, and then it's in our big plan, and that is to talk about ancillary species and to go beyond birds, right? To talk about, hey, you know, we're trying to make the argument that reddish egrets might be a good indicator or umbrella species, if you will, for tidal flats. But by conserving tidal flats, these are the fish species, these are the invertebrates, these are the other birds, these are the other things that benefit, you know, by, you know, if you will, a large predator like an egret, so to speak. And so, and that includes certainly other herons. Tricolors would be one bird that would obviously be in that group. So because we recognize that, I think we can make a lot of effort through single species conservation, but I also think that funders and when it comes to restoration work and things like that, they often are looking at how many species are going to benefit from a cause. And so we've more recently have tried to promote that this is going to benefit more than just reddish egrets.
I have just a general question to anyone about their experiences. So like Clay, you were saying that the reddish egret stuff's, you know, started with research, and obviously that requires funding. But if you don't if you have a species where nothing's really known about it, so many funders are a lot these days like not interested in single species approaches, which is going to create problems for species. But if you have a species where you don't know anything about it and you're trying to sell that we need to do research on this, but it's hard to find funding, so you can't even start that process of, like you said, starting with research to go into a conservation plan. And so I don't know other people's experiences just in general, but it's like a huge uphill battle starting from scratch when you don't have a way to get research done, from an institutional standpoint or a funding standpoint from the start.
That's I don't know if any others want to answer. Well, Jonah, I'll for those that don't know Jonah, right? Jonah's been working with Saddlebill and worked in my lab and graduated now, and I think he's starting a PhD program soon. But I would say, Jonah, kind of what you've been doing with Saddlebills, and that is, even if trying to get support and research, right, you were able to do studies and publish them, right, on distribution, niche modeling, things like that, that at least is bringing attention, right, providing data that may run contrary to the IUCN Red List status and the BirdLife International status to try to garner support for it. So I know that the jury's still out and it's something you're still championing, but I think approaches like that, I think they can be fruitful.
Yeah, that was the other thing that I didn't mention is also when they're like listed as least concern or whatever, it's just another impediment to getting anything done.
Well, I do say for any and everybody, right, and a major, with the Heron group, right, we are not the Red List Authority. I think everybody knows that for all birds, right, but for any birds. But I do believe, my bias, I guess, is that we have a better relationship with BirdLife International, and we've gotten more two-way communications with them. And I know I've reached out to a number of you to assist me when it came time to do the status review. And Jonah, to your point, for whatever taxa you're working on, herons aside, any species, right, I always encourage my students and people to see what the red list status is and see how you can provide information, data, because oftentimes there are going to be data gaps. And that's how one of the first things we did with Reddish Egrets 15 years ago was they were listed as least concern. And I'm not saying at all that they're endangered, right? Reddish Egrets compared to what we've heard today with things like white-bellied and Madagascar herons, but I think they deserved more than being least concern, right? And so getting involved, finding out that information and finding the source that you need to talk to, I think can help. I do want to add, Dale put a great question in chat, Jim. I don't know if you saw it, but I'll read it for you. It's, it's clear that place-based studies can play a significant role in conservation because management is inherently place-based. Jim, what is the balance between the single species focus you highlighted with place-based research and management?
The single species research is really required for those species that are seriously endangered. And there may well have to be conservation efforts directed totally at them, such as the white-bellied heron program. But it's always going to be about habitat. It's always going to be about areas. And we've already had a couple of discussions about landscape, how important it is that even these single species initiatives fit within multi-species and landscape initiatives. And for the most part, if we are not working on places like Dale, like the Everglades or Laguna Madre, if we're not working on national plans, if we're not working on even global planning, we're not going to find a space in the conservation world for a single species. So while we have to have our close attention to those species that are near extinction, endangered or threatened, or at conservation risk, we have to also look out for other 50 species, and that has to do with these larger scale planning and as you call it, place-based. So anyway, I think we have to do both of those things. And our job is to look after 62 or 65 species of herons, not just the 13 that we were talking about today. I also want to make a note of what Clay was just saying. You know, the bird groups are a little disappointed that they're not the red list authority for their groups. And so there was always some tension over the last years as BirdLife went about their business of being the red listing authority. But I'll tell you, in this last round, the communications was great. They were looking for our input. Our membership input went directly in there. So it's very important now for us to be able to assemble information on these species and feed it into the red listing mechanisms. One of the results this time of our engagement was the listing of the great white heron, its acceptance as a species and as an endangered species. And that really was an initiative from the group. So we can make a difference internationally because we have a good relationship now with BirdLife and their red listing authority.
Yeah, great points. And Kate, I'll get to you momentarily, but just to follow up with what Jim said, I was on a series of one-on-one calls with these various SSC focus groups or focus leaders. One was on freshwater species, one was on marine species. And one of the themes that came out of my discussions, they were basically interviewing me as sort of the heron chair and what we do, what we're trying to do, and things like that. And one of the things I never thought of until my conversations is that some taxa groups, all they do is do status review because they have so many species to update, and that's all they do. And they don't really have time to do anything else. And when I shared that we had a Heron Symposium coming up, that we had face-to-face meetings and virtual meetings, and we had a journal, she was like, that's not typical for specialist groups because outside the bird world, because that's all they do is status review. So to Jim's point, communications have improved greatly. And so I feel much more optimistic, and there'll be a time for us to be busy with the status groups or with the status assessments. But when we're not doing that, it gives us the capacity to do these kind of things. Kate.
You partially just answered my question, but Jim's comment made me think of a question I had this morning listening to the white-bellied heron talks. I was wondering, with like at this point, the heron specialist group is pretty well established. You guys have communications and a good network of people. So I was wondering how naturally, for a species like white-bellied heron, when there's so few animals left, how naturally are people able to talk and coordinate and share research kind of across the border or in very, far study sites? Is it really quick now that information is disseminated, or is it still, you still have to do a lot of work to make that happen?
I wish we had, I don't think we have any of our, I think our white-bellied heron folks are all in bed by now. From the morning. Jim, I don't know what your thoughts are, and you know more about the beginnings of the white-bellied group.
I'm sorry, you'd have to ask the question again. I was busy text chatting over here.
Just okay, go ahead. I don't want to paraphrase you.
That's great. Sorry, I in short, how, now that you're an established specialist group, how natural is it for information or data to be shared across country borders and things like that? Do you still have to do a lot of legwork to make that happen, or is it pretty rote by now?
I think what I've seen is that the group makes it happen, that it might not happen otherwise because, researchers in different countries don't often speak to each other. And borders are very firm, in a lot of parts of the world. So I think that it makes it happen. Everybody wants to publish their own paper, of course, and get their credit. But, the first workshop was held in Bhutan, which was actually hard to get to. So the second workshop was held in India. And so just by moving around, you're encouraging other stakeholders to take part. And then they've already been in communication with researchers in other places. So I think it's really enabling in terms of information sharing. The Agami Heron Working Group worked very hard and have worked very hard to extract information from all the places that we knew where Agamis were nesting. And some people were reluctant and they had reasons because they would protect their colony and so forth. But now, we've got this chart and everybody reports every year on what's happening in their colony. So I think it's very enabling.
Yep. No, and echo what Jim said. I think the having the meetings in different places, if you can afford that, or virtual meetings that are time zone friendly, those kind of different things, right? To be as accommodating and as inclusive as possible. We've had, when we meet in Mexico, right? The dominant language, right, at the meeting is going to be Spanish, because that's the people that are in attendance. Most of them are native Spanish speakers. And so us folks that are not very bilingual, right, we're at the disadvantage, as we should be, right? And so we try to do those things to make sure that, we're getting representation and getting buy-in from everyone. Yeah, to Jim's point earlier, you're probably going to have sometimes, right? In my years with Reddish Egrets, right, there's been a few, I don't know, can I say pissing contests over Zoom, but there's been a few territoriality things that you've had to deal with at times, but you work through it. And hopefully everybody knows at the end of the day, you're there to conserve the species and the habitat, and you try to work through those things. Poor Chip has fallen asleep.
Yeah, Chip. Hey, Chip, it looks like you're in church.
Oh, yes. I haven't been in church in decades.
That was perfect, Chip.
I fell asleep at a red stoplight once.
Well, it has been a long day on Zoom, I'll admit. And we could certainly continue, but I'll admit, for Chip and I and Kate and Jim and others, I know we've been on since whatever it was, 7:30 this morning. I do want to say one thing, and then I'm certainly opening it up for anybody else, but the Heron Specialist Group, right, it's open to any and everybody. So if you are not a member, if you are not receiving the emails, if you're not familiar with the working group, I'm going to put my email address in chat right now, and you are more than welcome. Please reach out to me about getting involved. And then we actually met in January. We had a Heron Specialist Group. It's hard to believe the year's flown by, but we've done these virtual meetings. And yes, I would love to be in person and be in Paraguay, meeting Alberto in person and having a beer. But, those days will come, hopefully. But I think there's real advantages to virtual as well. And so my plan is to be having more of these, with or without the Waterbird Society, just having them as our own specialist group, and then of course with societies like the Waterbird. So stay tuned for more information on that. One of the things Jim mentioned that is on my radar very soon is to work an update on the Heron Conservation Plan. Jim wrote the last version of that, which is in 2007. Hard to believe. It's going to be 15 years old next year, but it does need to be updated. And to Jim's point, I think said it really well, and that is that it can help, it's that global plan that can help, say, hey, at my local level, regional level, this is a global priority. So, how do we help you, secure funding, secure the resources to do the research? So I think in this virtual world that we live in today, it's going to make it a lot easier to update. Sorry, the sun is literally setting right on me. To update a conservation plan I envision a series of Zoom meetings at a continental level at your time zone friendliness, right? So that instead of Matt being tired, I'll be tired. But the goal is to basically go around the globe and to bring the people there in that area together to work through objectives for those continents. Basically take what Jim wrote 15 years ago and update and refresh that. So that's on my plan to roll that out early in the after the new year. So just be looking for that, and open and welcome to all ideas. But that's sort of my initial thoughts. This was done with the otter specialist group. Again, this is something I found out through my one-on-one meetings with the freshwater coordinator. And so there's a couple groups that have a really good model about how they updated a global plan when you've got critters all over the place. And so those are the kind of things that I'll be pursuing after the new year. Anything else? We all zoomed out. Well, I want to.
I think you can be very proud of what you all accomplished.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Jim. We're just standing on your shoulders. Chip, I said it. I give Chip grief because he fell asleep earlier, but Chip truly was the driving force behind this symposium. So all the credit goes to Chip. Chip, I really appreciate you staying on top of it, reaching out to all the researchers, pulling all these folks in. So Chip, thank you again for everything you did.
Well, thank you. And it was, I have to admit, I think having the Heron specialist group makes it relatively easy. I mean, we've got the researchers who work on the herons of conservation concern in our bunch. And I mean, all I had to do was talk to one or two people from the white-bellied heron group, and all of a sudden there were 6 others that should be contacted. Yep. And I mean, that's the beauty of the Heron specialist group, having our group of 85 or 90 or whatever it is. And I too certainly welcome anybody else who wants to join. But I mean, it keeps a cohesive group. And if you want to have a symposium in Africa or Southeast Asia or South America, you've got a group of people from those continents and they'll get the ball rolling. Yep. Yep. You laid a good basis, Jim, for this whole thing, and it's going and going and going.
Absolutely. Yeah. So yeah, that's all I have. I'll stay on if anybody has anything else, but just thank you again. There's some great talks the rest of the week. Again, Alberto mentioned he's got talks. Kate, I know you have a talk, right? Dale has a talk. So yeah, I know, and there's, I think, a million other people on here that I'm forgetting. I apologize. I'm just looking at pictures here, but Chip's got a talk. So, you know, a lot of great talks this weekend. And yes, Jim, are you okay with us sharing your PowerPoint with anybody interested?
Let me correct the Reddish Egret to purple heron.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, if you'll send it to Chip or I, Alberto, we will get that out.
Okay.
It would be very useful to educate a lot of people, a lot of decision makers. So share the presentation.
It's probably too big for my email. So if somebody can do a Dropbox thing for me or tell me who to go to. So yeah, but let me look it over and tweak it a little bit, and then somebody tell me where to send it.
Actually, yeah, I will. And thank you, Danielle. That was the next thing I was trying to remember. Yes, all talks are going to be recorded and eventually be posted on the Waterbird Society's YouTube channel. But Alberto, to your point, I'll get with Jim to get it onto a Google Drive or Dropbox so you can access it. But to Danielle's point, thanks to her work and Patty and many others, but certainly Danielle's done a lot for the Society's meeting. That'll all be available on YouTube.
Great.
All right. Thank y'all, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day, night, or morning. Good to see everybody.